Was it a family curse that caused the unthinkable tragedy that happened to this beautiful family? Or the unshakable desire to fulfill addiction, which perpetuated crimes and led to neglect in a continuous downward spiral? We have to start the story with Christine and Don Spirit. Christine married Don Spirit on December 10, 1988. They had 3 children together: Sarah Lorraine, born January 14, 1986, and she was born with only 1 kidney; Josh, born in 1990, and Kyle Matthew, born on June 2, 1992. The Spirits were told that Sarah would lead a normal life, even though she only had 1 kidney, and she shouldn't experience any issues. There was a chance of some slight loss in kidney function later in life, but this usually wasn't seen until about 25 years later. Don was a New Jersey native, and what is known is that the Spirit family had been living in Florida since 1995. Don seemed to get himself in trouble with the law quite a bit. I don't have information on his childhood, but if I were to guess from what we know about similar cases, I'd say he probably didn't have the best upbringing. The past could be repeating itself in this case over and over again. Don was convicted twice in South Jersey in 1987, just a year after his daughter Sarah was born. He pled guilty to 2 separate charges. One was theft by unlawful taking, and the other was a weapons offense. There may have been more offenses before this date as well, but the convictions that are known after the ones I just mentioned happened between 1989 and the year 2000. Don was arrested at least 13 times and charged with various misdemeanors and felonies. The charges included battery, drug possession, allowing a child under 14 to operate a boat, drunk driving, depriving a child of food and shelter, even driving without a license in a hit and run, leaving the scene of an accident involving a death. It's safe to assume Sarah, Josh, and Kyle were not growing up in the safest household or with the best role models. Christine did not have it easy either. Domestic abuse was apparently a regular part of her relationship with Don, and her kids witnessed this, giving them a false reality of what a healthy relationship looked like. This wasn't the occasional pushing or shoving. Don seemed to have a bad anger problem and could become very violent. In 2002, he smashed Christine's car with a sledgehammer, and he broke all the windows in the vehicle after threatening to kill her. When questioned by the police, Christine told officers she was afraid of her husband, but when they asked her to make a formal statement about the violence that Don directed at her, the officers said she refused. In many similar cases, the abused are afraid to leave or press charges because the system doesn't always protect them. They fear it will make matters worse, so they stay quiet. Christine decided not to prosecute Don, and instead he admitted himself for a mental health examination. Doctors diagnosed him with severe bipolar 1. It seemed like he could switch from normal to having extreme, uncontrollable outbursts, yet he would refuse to take or stay on medication. This incident with Christine's car was just a year after Don killed his son. Yes, Don killed his son Kyle. Kyle was only 9, and it's a sad story. It may have been the beginning of a wave that sent ripples through the Spirit family's future. The Spirits were living in a small single-family home in Tampa, Florida. This is what it looks like today. It had 3 small bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Kyle and Josh shared a room, and there was a big backyard for the children to play in. Like any mother, Christine loved her youngest son so much. She used to call Kyle Sweet Pumpkin Pie. When Kyle was just a toddler, he asked his mom to call him Applejacks, and that remained his nickname after that. It didn't matter what you called him. Kyle was a sweet, loving boy. He loved to go fishing, play soccer, basketball, and dreamed of playing in the NFL. Kyle wanted to do things with the boys. He didn't want to be left out. That was the first step in a series of events that would lead to his death. In 2001, Don planned a week-long hunting trip to Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, close to the rural town called Kenansville. It's located in Osceola County, which is 50 miles southeast of Orlando in South Florida. Don typically brought Josh along on his hunting trips. Josh was 11 at the time, and Kyle was only 9. Don didn't think Kyle was old enough to accompany them, but Kyle begged Don to let him come. He said that Josh always got to do the fun stuff, while he had to stay behind. Don told him he could come if he promised he would remain in the hunting stands, watching. He could not handle a gun or hunt with them. Kyle would need to stay there for hours at a time, so Don didn't think this would be much fun, but he gave in and let him go under those conditions. What do you think? Did you grow up around guns? Do you know how to shoot a gun? When was the first time you handled a gun, if you have? After the recent Oxford High School incident, some are questioning whether parents should allow children under the age of 18 to handle a firearm. After all, it is a deadly weapon. Is their frontal lobe developed enough to make adult decisions? That's the question. You tell me. Kyle didn't mind waiting around and watching because he loved animals and the forest. He could stare out into nature for hours and be entertained. Don was 38 at the time, and let's not forget, he was a convicted felon. Therefore, he was actually not legally allowed to own a firearm, but he did. Don purchased it from Christine's brother. What was interesting to me is that he was able to secure a hunting permit. You would think they would need to see something or check something to know that you were allowed to have a firearm. Don notified the school that both boys would be out for a few days. They piled into Don's red, white, and blue Nissan pickup truck with the window sticker that read, "I'd rather be hunting." They arrived at the area on Thursday, November 8th. They had a couple of days to settle in and hang out before deer season opened on Saturday. They planned to stay until Wednesday, November 14th. They were waking up around 5:30 every morning to begin hunting. All three of them were wearing bright orange clothing that's used to prevent accidental shootings. Don had a .300 Browning Magnum rifle, and Josh was carrying a .270. Kyle did as Don instructed and walked along with them, scoping out the area, unarmed. He did not touch a firearm the entire trip. On Tuesday, their last night there, Don cooked a big meal. Pork chops, green beans, potatoes, and corn because he didn't plan on hunting the next day. He figured, we'll have a big meal and we'll sleep in. As he had expected, Don was tired on Wednesday morning. He didn't plan on hunting, and he didn't feel like hunting that day, but the boys wanted to go into the woods. So, he drove them to a really good spot, and they went on a 2-hour walk. Unfortunately, they had not had the opportunity to shoot even one deer the entire trip, and by the time Wednesday came around, it was gloomy and rainy, and Don just wanted to get back home. So he began packing up as planned. As Don packed the truck, he put Josh's rifle into its case and proceeded to clean his to do the same. Half talking to the boys and half talking to himself, he said something to the effect of, "Would you look at that? There's rust on the muzzle of the barrel." He began to take his thumb and polish that area. He was rubbing some oil into it, and this was to remove the rust, not realizing that Kyle would actually come face to face with the weapon to look at it. As Don tried to position it back in the case, he accidentally bumped the trigger, trying to get it in. Kyle was shot in the head at point-blank range. Don was obviously in absolute shock about what had just happened. It happened so fast there was nothing he could do. There was no way to know what would happen. Don was frantic. He grabbed his phone and tried to call 911. Meanwhile, Josh was right there. He was witnessing the entire thing, and there was no cell service. The area was way too remote. So Don threw Kyle in the back of his pickup truck and raced back to the campsite as fast as he could. A man named Mike Evans, a 46-year-old from Fort Pierce, was driving out of the woods when he saw Don speeding up behind him. He didn't know what was going on, so he pulled over to let Don pass. That's when he saw Kyle in the flatbed. He could tell that Kyle was most likely fatally injured. He later said it was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. Evans decided to speed up and follow Don. Hunters were outside the campsite, and by this time, Don was able to get a hold of Christine. She went ahead and called the Osceola County Sheriff's Office to meet him at the campsite. The hunters saw Don screaming, and they ran towards him to help him out. Many of them were also calling for help. Don dropped to his knees and screamed. People said he was screaming, "Why me?" Evans was scared that Don might take his own life, so he and some other hunters decided to grab Don and take him away from Kyle's body. Others tried to make sure that Josh was okay. It must have been absolutely horrifying to see all of this play out in front of you with no way to help. Evans looked Josh in the eyes, held him by his shoulders, and told him to be strong for his parents. He said, "Now you have to be a man sooner than most." The paramedics arrived, but it was clear there was nothing they could do for Kyle. Detective Kerwin King explained it was a high-powered rifle. You could only imagine what it had done. A family allowed Josh and Don to stay in their camper until authorities figured out what to do next. Everyone that was at the campsite was in shock. Don was a complete wreck. He said he knew the gun was loaded, he just thought he had the safety on. He was adamant his hand never got near the trigger. It's so sad. It's so horrible. There's so much that goes into being a gun owner, so many steps to make sure everything is safe. Some of the hunters that were there that night said they wished there were more signs around the woods reminding hunters about gun safety. Others said they don't think anything could have been done to prevent it. It was an accident, but was it? What do you think? Was this an unfortunate accident, or did something happen between Don and Kyle? Was there something that set Don off that day? Was Kyle begging Don to stay, to hunt, to hold a gun? A part of me truly believes this was never intended, but it would change the course of Don's life forever. And not just because Kyle wouldn't be there anymore, but because it changed something in Don that day. Just a day later, reporters were already over at Christina and Don's home. Christine agreed to let a reporter in to speak with her. She was completely beside herself. She explained they were having a really difficult time coping. Christine told the reporter it was way too hard to talk about and that it's just been devastating, especially for Don. Christine said he was having a very hard time and that she was really worried about him. "I can only imagine, it's too horrible to even think about. You have just taken the life of someone you gave life to." Christine went on to explain they didn't even have enough money to pay for Kyle's funeral expenses. She wanted to make sure that everyone knew who Kyle was. She told the reporter that he had saved his allowance to buy a bike. He'd been saving for months, and he finally found one on clearance that was only $32. He used the remaining money to buy a bike for his brother, Josh. That's the type of kid Kyle was. He was a really good kid, and they missed him so much already. By November 17th, Don agreed to do an interview regarding Kyle's death. He told reporters that he wasn't going to bring Kyle on the trip, but he relented. He explained that Kyle loved animals and the forest. Don was sobbing through these words. He went on to say that made it even worse because Kyle was at a place he loved, and that would be the last time he would see any of that again. The reporter said that Don would switch between coherently explaining what happened and uncontrollably sobbing. All the while, Christine is right by his side. She's comforting him, rubbing his arm lovingly, and trying her hardest not to cry. Don kept repeating that it just happened so fast, and he didn't have time to think. He kept quickly shaking his head from side to side as he repeated that over and over again. He kept saying, "It's just unbelievable." He did this a number of times as though he was trying to shake the memories away. He sobbed even more when he explained that Josh saw everything. He regrets that he couldn't think clearly enough in the moment to tell Josh to stand back or to look away. Can you imagine? That would haunt you for the rest of your life. Josh actually came out of his room and sat down next to his dad. He hugged him. He told the reporter that they missed Kyle so much. One thing Don didn't forget to mention was that he knows he has been in trouble with the law, but he does not do drugs anymore. He did bring a 12-pack of beer on the trip, but he only had 3 of them the entire trip. He didn't drink any on the day of the shooting. At the end of the interview, Don said this, "I may not have lived the best life, but I know that this was an accident. I know none of that matters when it comes to my son being dead. Dead because something went really wrong." What do you think? At this point, investigators were looking into Don's past, especially his felony conviction he had in 1998 for the possession of marijuana over 20 grams. Convicted felons are not permitted to own guns, and he knew that. Yet, he went out of his way to buy one without leaving a paper trail. By the way, I don't know about you, but I was curious, so here's what 1 gram of marijuana looks like. With only 8 more grams, he would have had 1 ounce, and this is what 1 ounce looks like. Therefore, it was actually presumed that Don was selling it and not just carrying it around for personal use. After this hunting tragedy, free gun safety classes began to fill up in Osceola County. These classes were for both adults and children. They were conducted by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I was actually surprised to read that the director of hunter education said that kindergarten was when children should start to learn about gun safety. I guess it makes sense if you're thinking about toy guns and video games. Kids do need to know in advance that guns are dangerous and that the real ones are not to play with. I was initially thinking, when I read it, that he meant kindergartners should be learning how to shoot guns at 4 or 5 years old. Again, I am not well versed in hunting or guns in general, so this may be the norm. One of the National Rifle Association certified instructors, Bob Greer, said that many gun owners become complacent. They think they know how to handle a gun safely and properly, but at times when they take the classes, they find out they were mistaken. It takes hours for gun safety to become second nature. That way, in spur-of-the-moment situations, your muscle memory kicks in. Don and Christine decided to move out of their home, which brought back way too many memories, and start fresh, leaving Tampa and moving to Bell, Florida. Bell is a small, rural community in North Florida. It only has about 500 residents, I think less back when this happened, and it's located in Gilchrist County. The town was founded in the 1890s. It was named after a beauty pageant winner, Belle Fletcher. Maybe that was the most important thing that happened in this town, because it's so small. I can only imagine how much smaller it would have been back then, and I'm not trying to be facetious. You'll see what I mean. The per capita income in Bell is only about $12,000. Around 13% of the families and 17% of the population were below the poverty line. 19% of those were under the age of 18. This town is also 95% white, and it reminds me a lot of the town of Santa Claus, Georgia, that I talked about in the Daniels family slayings. I was curious about why they would pick Bell. This is a place that grows peanuts. There are cows roaming around in fields, and this is where more tragedy will occur. There's just so much land and not a whole lot to do, except maybe fishing and hunting. All I see when I look at this map is springs, swamps, and rivers. When I look at this picture, I promise you I can smell it, I can feel it. The humidity, the smoke from campfires or people's cigarettes or a barbecue. That gives you an idea of what it's like near Bell. The culture, the weather, the lifestyle, the type of people. That's it. Bell is not this exciting at all. It's 20 minutes away, and it's surrounded by mostly industrial companies, building suppliers, concrete businesses, a plantation, and just a bunch of churches. It's very hard to find work there. Residents that live there say that it's a nice, quiet, agricultural community. It's a close-knit community. If anything were to happen to any of your neighbors, someone would be so kind as to set up a donation box, and then everyone would pitch in. There are very few jobs. Most of the good ones involve things like hard labor, hauling rocks, sand, logs. Look at this. This is one of the major roads running through it. It's US 129. And these little turndowns, they're just dirt roads. Google Maps won't even let you go down these roads. However, you have to keep making your way down, and that is where the driveway would be. Right here on the map I can show you, that's where the driveway would be. They are desolate. There is nothing there. Even your neighbors are not really that close. Let's jump back into Don and Christine. It's common for residents in Bell to live in mobile homes on several acres, and that is what Don and Christine did too. They moved to a mobile home on 2 acres of land in Bell, which they purchased, wait for it, for only $2,204.69 back in 1996. So maybe that's why they moved there. About a year later, in 2002, Don was arrested for driving his car on a suspended license since he had accumulated a number of convictions relating to traffic offenses. One, like I said, involving a hit and run with the death of another person. This time he was charged with what Florida refers to as a habitual felony. He was ordered to pay $43,500 in court costs, including fines. Remember, this is a family who couldn't even afford to bury their son. They did not have a lot of money. They had been struggling to make ends meet for quite some time, and they were just getting hit with blow after blow. They just couldn't get ahead. Now the authorities were really looking into Don's past, and a couple of months later, he was charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon in connection to Kyle's death. It took about 2 years for the case to be resolved. As soon as the trial date was set, Don actually took a plea deal. It was on January 23, 2003, in exchange for a lighter sentence. Originally, he would have been facing up to 15 years in prison if a jury had convicted him. Don was already 40 at the time, and he said he just couldn't go through such an emotional trial. Outside the courtroom, Don and Christine were just sobbing. Christine was wearing a shirt, and it had Kyle's face on it in full color, with the words "My Special Angel" and his nickname, Apple Jacks, on it. Through tears, she said she was worried about how her family would hold up with all of this. First Kyle's death, and now Don going away for 3 years. She said she didn't know how you would prepare for something like this. Then she explained how she thinks about Kyle all the time. She even kept a box full of trinkets, shoes, clothing, and all sorts of items of Kyle's to remember him. Don told the media there was nothing he could do, probably referring to the fact that he could not change what happened. Don was out on bond until his sentencing hearing on March 3rd. There was an interesting comment from Mike Saunders. He was the Deputy Felony Bureau Chief for the State Attorney's Office. He said, "It's a tragedy all the way around, but if Don had followed the law and not possessed a firearm, his child would not be dead." I had not really put that together for some reason, but he's got a point. No gun, no way for this to occur. Don's own public defender, Don Wagoner, said the jury would have probably found him guilty because they couldn't offer them facts not to. Don could have chosen to take the necessary legal steps after his felony to undergo a process to restore his right to own a firearm, but he chose not to. And I think I know why, because when I was looking into it, I realized that when you have a criminal record, it's super expensive. You have to get a pardon, which includes filing an application with the state, and that requires a lawyer so you can fill it out properly. And then after that, with all the other fees, you're looking at a couple $1,000s, and it still might not be approved, considering the likelihood is much smaller if you're like Don and have more than 10 convictions. Don was sent to serve his sentence at Hamilton Correctional Institution in North Florida. Christine was constantly worried because she thought that every time the phone rang, she was going to pick it up and the prison was going to be calling her to tell her that Don had taken his life. She was so sad because her children were missing out on their father being there for important milestones, like Josh turning 13, becoming a teenager, and Sarah having their first grandchild. At this time, Don's daughter Sarah was only 17 and pregnant with her first child. Sarah had dropped out of high school in 11th grade, and she was working at a fast food restaurant and a local grocery store. She had started dating a man named Edward Neil Coleman, and their child was due in November. Don would be in prison the next 3 years and miss out on meeting and spending time with his grandchild. I am sure that this was added pain for the Spirit family. Not to mention, not having Don around made Christine a sudden single mother. She did find a job. She was selling life insurance to make ends meet. It was sad. Her surviving son, Joshua, was suffering from deep depression. You have to remember he witnessed it all. He saw that. I have to look at those things in my classes for death investigation, but to see someone that I love in that state and that condition and watching it happen and play out, it would scar you for life, he said. Sarah gave birth to her first son, Caleb, on November 22, 2003. She really wanted to name her son Kyle, but Christine was against it. She told Sarah it was way too much. It would bring back a lot of memories every time she would see him or hear the name. So that was a no. On June 20th, Christine Joshua, only 13, his friend Liam, 12, and his cousin Louie, 8, took a 3-hour drive from Bell to where Kyle was killed. Then they had to go 7 miles deep into the woods at the wildlife management area. They were there to honor Kyle for what would have been his 11th birthday. Christine had visited 2 times before and left flowers and all kinds of little trinkets, but this time it was to place a brass plaque next to an oak tree that was planted in Kyle's memory. The family was still having a hard time coping. Christine said that being there helped to remember him, especially when she was walking through the woods. She said it was hard for her to explain. Biologist H.W. Harder III was the one that was working there. He was installing the plaque and said he thinks he can explain it. It's a reminder, and accidents do happen. Okay, I think it's a little deeper than that, because people report being in nature makes them feel connected to the loved ones that passed away. Maybe it's the quiet calm or the noises that we can hear when everything's been blocked out. When all the sounds from everyday life aren't there anymore, there's just this still calm, and you can hear the sounds of nature. Have you experienced this? Many times I hear people say that they can feel their loved ones when they see a butterfly or a rainbow. There's just something about being in nature that gives them a feeling of peace and connection to the deceased. It would have been hard for Don. He couldn't be there. But Christine said at this point she felt like she had lost him as well. He was probably just a shell of who he was before. Sarah really wanted to go too, but she had just had the baby and she couldn't make a 3-hour trip. As Harder put the plaque into place, the only sound they could hear was the rhythmic beating of the rain. When Josh saw the plaque, he fell to his knees, pulled his legs up to his chest, and sat in that fetal position, continuing to cry. The group just held on to one another for support. Christine said she felt completely empty, but she had to keep it together because if she broke down, she would not be able to help the boys and her family who couldn't help themselves. She had to be that pillar and stay strong. Speaking of which, it took a lot to make this decision, but Christine filed for divorce from Don in 2005 after over 20 years together and just 1 year before he was expected to be released. Being the victim of Don's violence, Christine probably felt like it was now or never. He was locked up, she could get away and start over and be safe, and that's what she did. The same year, on April 16th, Sarah had her second child with Edward. They named her Kylie Marie, Kylie after Kyle, so this time she got her wish. Don was released from prison the next year, in 2006, and he moved back to the mobile home. He had gained sole possession of the property during the divorce. Life was a lot different when Don came back. He had 2 new grandchildren, and his daughter was only 19. She had a 3rd baby on the way. Yes, a 3rd baby, another baby with Edward. All that responsibility, his wife gone, having to fend for himself without his family, plus having to figure out how to reconnect and fit himself into his children's worlds. Sarah was not doing well. Edward was always in trouble with the law, and she had been experimenting with drugs, plus hanging out with a bad crowd. She was also responsible for looking after her younger brother, Josh. At this time, do you think that having a father like Don made Sarah attracted to men that were similar to him? Because I see that happening sometimes. It doesn't make sense because you'd think you know you can do better, but it happens. What do you think about Sarah having a 3rd child? People can choose to do whatever they want, but it's hard, very hard. Children are a huge responsibility, not to mention the extra expenses, and she was practically a child herself. She's only 19. Her boyfriend's not doing much. He's proving to be very unreliable. She couldn't work since she couldn't afford daycare, and she had those kids. This left her parents or anyone around her to help pick up the slack. But we'll never know why Sarah wanted to have more children. She gave birth to her 3rd child, Jonathan Neil Coleman, on March 19, 2006. But at this point, even as happy as they were facing eviction, and they had no food in their house. That same year, the Department of Children and Families, DCF, was called. A neighbor found Sarah's oldest child, Caleb, with bite marks and bruises, and he was wandering the streets with a steak knife. The neighbor told the DCF that Sarah used drugs like crazy and was constantly leaving her children in cracked ends. A DCF report that I read from August 21, 2006, indicates that both Sarah and Edward were allegedly perpetrators against their children regarding endangerment, which could have included injuries. When the caseworkers arrived, they noticed that 2-year-old Jonathan was in a cast. He had a cast on his leg. Sarah was trying to explain that he fell off a trampoline. As the investigators were questioning her, they asked her why a baby his age would be allowed on the trampoline, and then they asked where it was, and there was no trampoline. Evidence showed they didn't believe Sarah, yet they did nothing to make sure that these children were safe from harm. There was another report a few months earlier that Edward had beaten Sarah in front of the children. No ongoing services were provided to the family. Their caseworker concluded that the children were not in danger and therefore they were not removed. They didn't think that Edward and Sarah were causing the injuries to the children, so the case was closed. By 2007, the DCF had referred Sarah to get help to voluntarily obtain the services she might need. They could teach her how to be a better mom. They could give her different resources so she could learn what to do differently, but she refused. Edward was in and out of jail, and she was bouncing around between Christine's house and Dawn's house. Anytime Edward was not around, Sarah usually ended up at Dawn's. The DCF was continuing to receive reports that these children were at risk for abuse and neglect. The calls to the DCF hotline included allegations of substance abuse, domestic violence, medical neglect, and inadequate supervision of these children. Sarah would leave the children with relatives and wouldn't return. She wouldn't contact them for days or even weeks at a time. In February 2007, reports showed that Sarah was ordered to relinquish custody of her children. And I was like, finally, these children are going to be removed. But not for long. She signed a power of attorney, relegating the children's care to other family members. The children were given to different caretakers, which I thought was a little bit odd, but I don't have all of the details. I know Christine, that's Sarah's mom, took Caleb, and a woman named Linda Dickinson, I don't know the relation, took Kylie and Jonathan, who went to a woman named Tammy Sassani, who's related to the Spirit family. These children did not have it easy. That's an understatement. They had been tossed around and cared for by many different people. That's a lot of instability for such young children who need a lot of structure and attention. It seems like 2007 was the start of a complete downward spiral, not only for Sarah, but also where her brother Josh Spirit's criminal record begins. There's burglary, larceny, and it does not end there. Josh seems to continue to get in trouble with the law, just like his dad and his sister. And here's a picture of Josh. This is from his Facebook. Notice he has a tattoo commemorating his brother Kyle. He has another tattoo that reads, "There is no safer place to be than in God's loving hands, safer in death than in life." I guess that seems to ring true in this case. Just a month after handing the kids over, the DCF allows them to be returned to Sarah, and now she's being investigated again, this time for inadequate supervision relating to Caleb and threatening to harm Jonathan. The DCF finally says, okay, we need to provide some services, so they provide what's called in-home services with a community-based agency called Partnership for Strong Families. So we have the DCF and we have the PSF. The PSF is contracted by the DCF to deliver comprehensive child welfare services to children who are victims of abuse and neglect. There are definitely obvious systematic issues with the way the DCF handled this case. The DCF investigates and screens out situations that don't meet the state's definition of maltreatment because they want to know, are we wasting our time or is this for real? So they kind of do a welfare check. If the issues are verified, then the PSF will come in to do these in-home services, which include interviewing the children, the parents, counseling sessions, a care plan, etc. But there's really not somebody there watching. Instead, parents can even refuse the services. They're either voluntary or involuntary, and these are voluntary services. You can take them or leave them. However, if they do refuse, they at the very least have to provide the contact information of a family member, and then that person kind of becomes the third party, the extra person responsible. They have to agree that they're going to make sure everything's going to be okay. Not that reliable, especially when you have family members who are doing just as poorly as you are. Otherwise, the PSF will be there working on the case, but it doesn't say how often they're there. Once a day? I don't think so. Are they there once a month? I don't know. It says that they provide assistance with food, housing, rent, utilities, clothing, medical care, transportation, employment, legal services, substance abuse and mental health care, crisis intervention. You get the idea. They even help with family planning, so if she didn't want to have any more children, this would be the time she would become educated and get on birth control. That's a lot of weight on a person's shoulders, and it proves to be too much for the workers in this case. Edward's mother tried to alert the DCF to the fact that the children were being neglected. Once again, she notified them her grandson Caleb was so hungry he was hoarding food. He didn't know when he was going to get fed next. She said no child should go through that. This time, she threatened to call the media if the DCF refused to step in. It's weird because reports show that when the caseworkers came to check on Sarah and the kids would be dressed well, they looked happy, they were clean. But I keep thinking, looks can be deceiving. There are so many pictures of these beautiful children, and Sarah's beautiful, she's a beautiful woman. She's got these big blue eyes, this really pretty smile, and her kids are absolutely adorable. I'm guessing that she knew how to charm the caseworkers and make believe everything was fine. Just a year later, in 2008, Sarah was pregnant once again. This is her fourth child, and this time it's with another man. His name is James Stewart. Most people refer to him as Jamie, so that's what I'm going to do too. He was also in and out of jail, not a steady fixture in their lives. There was a report in February that Jamie had been abusing substances in the home with the children there. The DCF concluded that he had to enter a treatment facility and provide power of attorney to Christine. Sarah, Jamie, and the kids were living in a shack. It was a very small structure in the back of Jamie's family's property. One of the neighbors said that Sarah would come over all the time, knocking on their door, asking for food or diapers. She didn't have anything. I thought the DCF was supposed to be giving her things. I don't understand, but we'll find out. At this point, from what I could gather on police reports, her three other children's father, Edward, was facing a number of years in prison. So it's safe to assume he wouldn't be part of Sarah's or the kids' lives for long, if ever. Sarah moved to Christine's house in Fort Pierce, Florida, and while she was there, she was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor in March. She was 22 at the time, and there was an 18-year-old living there as well. She might have gotten caught buying him alcohol. That's the only thing I can think of. I can't find any information on it, just the charge. And the 18-year-old was named Christopher Jeffers. I know that Christine has the last name Jeffers as well, so they had to be related, but I don't know how. Just 3 months later, in June, Sarah was once again charged in connection to stealing when she was caught shoplifting at a retail store. This was a subsequent offense, which carried additional fines and consequences. By August 27, 2008, Sarah was living with Dawn again. She was 8 months pregnant when she called the police to let them know Dawn was beating her up in front of her 3-year-old daughter, Kylie. He was also threatening to beat up Kylie and Jonathan. She told police that she was very scared of him. He was 6 feet 2 inches and weighed over 200 pounds. She told them, "I know what he's capable of." When an officer arrived on the scene, he found Sarah visibly shaken, with red marks on both sides of her face. She said that Dawn became enraged. She was telling him she couldn't afford to pay his taxes for his property where they both lived. Sarah could hardly take care of herself. She was unemployed, and she had nowhere to go. She was sitting there trying to reason with her dad, telling him, "I'm gonna get the money. My friends are gonna help me." But apparently, Dawn either didn't believe her, or he could have just been fed up. All of a sudden, she said he grabbed her by the arms, shoved her up against the refrigerator, and then he took both of his hands and placed them on the sides of her face, squeezing her cheeks together really hard. You could see there were red marks just below her eyes on her face, like fingerprints. Do you recall if you were following the Gabby Petito case when she explained to the officers what Brian Laundrie had done to her? He had grabbed her face and pushed her. It's so similar and it's so sad. Sarah told police that Dawn threatened to make her life a living hell if she ever reported him. But this time, she did. She said she needed a restraining order against him because he was starting to become physical with her children. He was hitting them with belts until they were black and blue. When Gilchrist County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the mobile home the next day to arrest Dawn, of course he refused to come out. He told them, quote, "The only way you're going to get in here is to break down the door and throw in tear gas." But eventually he gave up and he was taken into custody. He was later sentenced to 6 months in jail. Sarah's fourth child, Destiny Nicole Stewart, was born just 1 month after this incident, on September 27, 2008, completely healthy, beautiful little girl. Just weeks later, Sarah is writing a letter to the court. I have some of it right here that I saw on the news, and she's sitting there asking for leniency in her dad's case, taking the blame for what happened. Part of the letter says, quote, "I forgive him for what he did, and I'm willing to stand by his side and help him through his problems." While Dawn was awaiting trial, Sarah wrote a letter to the judge asking that he not be sent back to prison. She said, "I love my father. He's the only family I have, and he's a big part of mine and my children's lives." The letter stated that since Spirit accidentally killed her brother Kyle, he hadn't been emotionally or mentally stable. She also said he would die if he goes to prison, and it would kill me to know I put him there. I personally think this was a result of her being alone with all of her children. She was in desperate need of support. So at this point, she doesn't even care if it's her abusive father. She just needs somebody. That wasn't the first time that this happened. There were a number of violent incidents between Sarah and Don from the moment that he got out of prison, probably even before he went to prison, considering the way he treated Christine. Many of the reports included details about how Don would constantly terrorize his family. Don had issues with his anger in the past. He would blow up and act with violence out of nowhere. Sarah said he had a violent temper, and she was scared of him. She must not have been that scared, or her desperation outweighed her fear because she never showed up for the hearing. The petition was dismissed by refusing to testify against him, and a court domestic violence protection order was dropped, which opened her up to the possibility of suffering more abuse. By this time, Sarah had also been in trouble with the law a number of times herself. Her first offense dates all the way back to 2000, when the Spirits lived back in Tampa and she was about 13. She was charged with operating a boat without a boater's license. And Don was also charged in this case because he was the one that allowed her to operate the vessel illegally. Sarah seemed to stay out of trouble, or at least she wasn't caught, until about 1 year after she and Don were reunited. She was charged with larceny just a couple of days after Independence Day in 2004 while she was living at Don's. It was considered a first-time offense, plus it was for items totaling less than $100. So she didn't have much in the way of consequences, if any, just a little slap on the wrist. Later that same year in December, she was charged with burglary and trespassing. So we can assume the punishment for the first offense wasn't enough to deter her. Maybe Don contributed to Sarah's downfall. Their relationship was described by family and close friends as a tumultuous, violent father-daughter relationship, fighting one day, caring for each other the next. It was a cycle of love and hate. Jamie Stewart's aunt Colleen kept track of things. Jamie is the father of Sarah's third and fourth child, Destiny and Jonathan. Colleen became close to Sarah. When she was asked about Sarah and Don's relationship, she would say that one day, Don wouldn't want anything to do with her and the kids. And then out of nowhere, he would just bring them food and groceries and be all kind and loving. Both Colleen and her daughter Katie, who was only a teenager at the time, helped out with the kids. I pulled up Don's criminal record and found out that in 2009, Don was once again picked up for another traffic violation, this time DUI. It was reduced to reckless driving, which sounds worse, but to me, after everything else we know about his convictions in the past, it seems like nothing. Meanwhile, the man that Sarah had her first 3 children with, Edward Coleman, was now in a new relationship with another woman named Tiffany Hunt. Tiffany gave birth to their son, Edward Neil Coleman, on November 22, 2009, the same birth date as his first son, Caleb, born 6 years earlier. Sadly, just like the fate of the boy that Caleb was supposed to be named after, little Kyle Edwards' baby died just 4 months after he was born, on April 1st. I pulled up Don's criminal record and found out that in 2009, the same birth date as his first son, Caleb, born 6 years earlier. Sadly, just like the fate of the boy that Caleb was supposed to be named after, little Kyle Edwards' baby died just 4 months after he was born, on April 1st, 2010. It's just so sad. The baby was so little, and I searched and I couldn't find any information regarding how he died. I do know that they had a funeral service and a burial at Trinity Memorial Gardens in Pasco County, Florida. Tiffany had another child before Edward Jr., and her name was Mariah Grace Coleman. I'm not sure if she was Edwards or not, but she did have the same last name. I was able to locate who I think is Tiffany Hunt, and I got to see pictures of her and her family. She is since married and has a bunch of beautiful children. She's not married to Edward, and sadly, he couldn't be at his baby son's funeral because he was locked up. I'm just trying to give you a feel of the individuals that were surrounding these children and where they came from. That's why I'm telling you all these details. Just 2 months before this, on September 2, Edward was evading authorities. There was a warrant out for his arrest for a violation of probation. Fabulous. The U.S. Marshals in the Tampa Police Department created a task force to apprehend Edward. He was considered armed and dangerous, with a known history of violence. U.S. Marshal Scott Lee heard over the radio that Edward was coming out of his car and then fleeing on foot, running toward a drive-thru of a Checkers fast food restaurant. Lee was driving his car toward Coleman. He was flashing his lights and his siren was blaring. He drove across Hillsborough Avenue. He went over the center median and drove toward the Checkers parking lot. He sees that there are no vehicles exiting the drive-thru, thank goodness, and he also sees that Coleman is in the drive-thru area. Edward Coleman, I keep going back and forth, I think you know. So, Lee enters the drive-thru going 15 miles per hour. That's fast, but authorities were worried because they wanted to catch him as soon as possible. There was a middle school right behind Checkers, and it was just letting out. This was a potentially armed and dangerous criminal. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he's going 50 miles an hour. He sees him jump in front of the patrol car. He didn't have a second to stop, and Lee struck him with the vehicle. The car jumps over the curb and lands right against a retaining wall, pinning Coleman against the wall and injuring him as a result. Just like in the movies or a TV show, right after he heals, he's locked up and taken to prison. This time he's sentenced to 25 years in prison, and you probably could have guessed. Needless to say, he was never going to be involved in his children's lives again. Let's turn to Sarah's new boyfriend, James Stewart. They had their first child in 2008, which was Sarah's fourth child, Destiny Stewart. 2 years had gone by between the time that she had her third child with her previous boyfriend, Edward, who we just got done talking about. As I pointed out, Jamie wasn't on his best behavior. He was also in trouble with the law. Because they lived in such a small town, it made me think of this proverb. I'm sure you've heard it before. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Breaking it down to its meaning, someone who's unoccupied and bored will find mischief. Someone who has nothing better to do will partake in something that will get them into trouble. James Lawson Stewart was born in December of 1990. He was only 18 when he and Sarah had their daughter, Destiny. Sarah was 22. They were so young, and I'm sure that Sarah expected Jamie to take some responsibility for her other kids as well, not just Destiny, but I'm not sure Jamie was willing, ready, able to do so at all. He was around more before 2012 because that is when most of his criminal cases seemed to have been going to court, and he was just in and out of jail. His sister Colleen was definitely around more than he was when it came to Sarah and the kids, especially because she had her new niece, Destiny. Colleen Stewart was born in February of 1979. She was 11 years older than Jamie. Since she was closer to 30, I'm sure that Jamie and Sarah saw her as more of an adult than they were and possibly counted on her for advice and assistance. However, Colleen had been getting in trouble with the law since at least 1998, back when she was around the same age that they were, about 19. Colleen's daughter was 11 at the time. Her name was Katie. I'm sure it was nice for Katie to play with Sarah's kids too, even though Sarah's oldest, Caleb, was only 5. Kids like to play together. Colleen and Katie spent a good deal of time either at Don's or at Jamie and Sarah's place. They became very close friends, if not best friends, and they probably considered each other family. Their closeness and their relationship come into play a bit later, and definitely had some part in the horrific events that end up occurring just 6 years later. Colleen's criminal record includes offenses for resisting arrest, larceny, theft, violence toward a police officer, and driving with a suspended license. 5 children under the age of 8, with Brandon being just a newborn that needed a lot of attention. There's no surprise DCF was once again at Sarah and Jamie's house. They just couldn't do it. They were not able to fend for themselves. It was in November when there was a report called in that Caleb had sustained burns to his body. In-home services were started once again with the PSF. Did they remove the children? No. Burns on the body. I'm not sure if it was the increasing number of children or if the children were getting older and needing more supervision. I don't know if that resulted in the continued and more intense issues that surrounded this family, and maybe it was the compounding circumstances. It was a sick cycle no one could escape. It was one thing after another. More children, more problems. They were unstable parents in poverty, unable to appropriately care for their kids. They knew that they were seen as failures by the state and by their community. Since the town was so small, neighbors from everywhere they lived had called DCF on them. Was this leading Sarah to seek comfort in drugs, which was resulting in more issues and eventually addiction? Addiction leading to needing more money to get her fix, and then using state funds to do that, overfeeding her own children? That's what I assumed. It's one theory. Those are assumptions we can make. But whatever it was, things got worse. They got so desperate for drugs that Don decided to begin growing marijuana on his property, either for self-use or to sell. In Florida, cultivating marijuana is a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison, as well as a $5,000 fine. Don could not afford to be doing this, but he did it. And what's worse is it becomes a first-degree felony if there are any minors living at the residence where the plants are being grown. He gets caught, but this wasn't a professional operation. There were way less than 25 plants, which is the threshold for what kind of felony you're going to get. Therefore, Don did not get sent to prison, but he did have his driver's license suspended for another 6 months. Don even tried to sue both Sarah and her ex, Edward, for child support. Kylie had just started kindergarten at Bell Elementary School. Caleb was already attending school, and the teachers were very familiar with the Spirit family, as they had been dealing with previous issues regarding Caleb's well-being. There was a time when he reported they had no electricity in the trailer. This poor little boy told teachers that the adults got to eat good dinners. They got to have steak and chicken, but the kids were only allowed to eat ramen noodles or cereal. School was also notified that both children had been caught stealing food from the other kids at school because they were so hungry. That year, the PSF was working with Jamie and Sarah again after a report that the children had severe and chronic cases of head lice. Kylie was not allowed to return to school until the issue was resolved. Instead of Sarah caring about her daughter's education, she ignored the bugs and just didn't send Kylie back. Therefore, poor Kylie needed to repeat kindergarten the following year. On November 2, 2010, Jamie and Sarah were once again being investigated by the DCF, this time for a cigarette burn or a cigarette lighter burn that his teacher noticed on the side of his neck. Good old PSF stepping in again to attempt to get this family back on track. This is where I would have to truly stop and consider the danger that these children were in. Burning a child or a child just becoming burned by themselves due to neglect and the lack of supervision is a huge issue. I've seen kids get removed from homes for way less, yet the children are still there. One issue was that different caseworkers would be responding to these incidents over the years. The DCF would explain that the agency would view things as a snapshot, like this is a snapshot of what this family is like, rather than a movie. So if you're looking at all the ins and outs and all the characters that are at play, you can see the big picture. But if you're just looking at a snapshot, you really don't know what's going on. Essentially, they were not putting two and two together, even though children's lives were at stake here. The times that Sarah and Jamie were the caregivers and the caseworkers were investigating them, they wouldn't do enough research into Don's past. Let's say he's a convicted felon with a checkered past. So when they wouldn't volunteer to get help, Sarah and Jamie would turn to Don as a support system. He was the one that, remember I said, signs off as a third party. The police, EMTs, and the school resource officers in Bell were familiar with the Spirit family. Yet none of these reports seemed to come together and paint the horrific picture of this family's grim reality. Without enough money to afford the drugs they were used to acquiring, Jamie started to buy synthetic marijuana for him and Sarah. I had heard about synthetic marijuana back in the day, probably around the same time it was a popular alternative. Plus, it was legal then, but it's not legal now, at least not in Florida. I never knew what it was or why anyone would want to use a synthetic drug like that when they could just get the real thing. But it turns out it's cheaper, easier to get, and it gets you just as high, if not higher. It's shredded plant materials that are sprayed with a chemical similar to chemicals found in marijuana, but it's not the same. In fact, it's not safe and may affect the brain much more powerfully than marijuana. The effects can be unpredictable and in some cases more dangerous or even life-threatening. These synthetic drugs are psychoactive and affect how the brain works. They can change your mood, your awareness, thoughts, feelings, and your behavior. I also read somewhere that they can be up to 100 times more potent than THC. According to law enforcement, police say that this drug is partly responsible for a spike in violent crime. What made them popular to Sarah was that you could get them in smoke shops, novelty stores, and even gas stations. You can buy them over the internet as well. They also come in flashy packaging that can look cool to kids, making it more enticing or seem fun. Its street name is Spice. The specific brand of spice that Sarah and Jamie liked to buy was called K2. Users have reported symptoms of psychosis, delusional or disordered thinking, and detachment from reality. They have psychotic effects as well, which could include extreme anxiety, confusion, paranoia, and extreme and unreasonable distrust of others, hallucinations, sensations, and images that seem real but are not really there. I bet you know where I'm going with this. It's important to keep all of these things in mind as you hear about what happens just a few years after the Spirit family begins their journey into making spice a normal part of their lives. This spice is not the spice of life. It's actually one of the catalysts of death. As a matter of fact, Sarah called 911 a few months after starting to smoke spice. She and Jamie were having some kind of bad reaction, and paramedic Devin Taylor came out to Jamie and Sarah's place to check on them. He took their vital signs, made sure they were okay, and then just went on his way. Sarah was warned of the dangers and not to have it around her children, but that did not stop her. The next 3 years were some of the worst for this family, as though they hadn't been through enough already. In 2011, while Sarah was living with Jamie, Dawn took her to court, claiming that she was taking child support payments she wasn't supposed to because he had been watching her son, Jonathan. Dawn said he was supposed to be getting those payments. Surprisingly, the judge sided with Dawn on this one. Sarah was ordered to pay him $6,578 in back payments, so you could see how much she was getting from these support payments. That's a lot of money. I just wonder how many months that was, but that's a lot. So now she's supposed to be paying Dawn $100 a month to clear this up. I was thinking, how was she supposed to get this money? I guess she could give him any other support payments that she was getting that were coming in, but then how would she fund her addiction? Interestingly, by the way, anytime the children were at Dawn's or Christine's, their paternal grandparents' homes, wherever they were, The public assistance payments wouldn't be made out to Sarah anymore. They would be made out to whoever the children were with at the time. So some have argued that the children were tossed around and taken in by certain family members because those family members wanted the money and not necessarily out of the kindness of their hearts. On January 21, 2012, there was a call to the DCF, but when they went out to screen the family, they didn't find anything that would warrant further investigation, so they just dropped the case. There must have been something going on, because a month later on February 28th, the DCF was back at Jamie and Sarah's. Caleb had sliced open his foot on a piece of glass. No idea how this happened or where, but he was sent to school like that without any treatment being done by his parents. When his teacher noticed how deep this cut was, she immediately sent him to the school nurse. The nurse was pretty shocked, so she phoned Sarah right away and told her, "You need to get him looked at by a doctor, like now." Instead, when Caleb came home from school, she didn't take him to the doctor. She dunked his foot in a tub of bleach, put toilet paper around his wound, and duct taped it. I know how bad hydrogen peroxide is, but bleach. Caleb came to school once again, and the nurse didn't know what to do, so she called the school resource officer. His name is David Adelholtz, and he decided to bring Caleb to the doctor. The doctor provided Adelholtz with all the instructions on how to clean the wound, and he relayed all of this to Sarah. But instead of doing what she was supposed to do to help him, she was back on drugs and not paying any attention to any of the children. Because Sarah wasn't supervising the children, they ended up leaving the residence and were picked up by neighbors. The neighbors brought them straight to the police station, and you'd think someone was going to get arrested or charged. No. No charges were brought against them. They just got the children and brought them right back. This time, though, the pure lack of follow-through on cleaning and caring for Caleb's foot, which was now showing signs of infection, finally pushed the DCF caseworkers to finally threaten legal action against her if she didn't start being more responsible. But you see, threats are not actions, mostly because instead of removing the children, they would believe Sarah's promises and just allow her to refuse services again and again, providing no supervision to protect these children. For the next 8 months, the PSF and the DCF provided the family with in-house services, once again hoping that they could educate and assist Sarah to become a better caregiver. She would engage in the services here and there. The case finally closed once again in September of 2012, when Sarah refused help once again. She explained that the drugs were not the problem, it was her epilepsy. She wasn't herself lately, according to her, because she had had seizures and was suffering from stress and anxiety attacks. Still, she refused to get help, and there were no medical records indicating she had epilepsy. It was most likely the spice that was making her feel that way. She also told caseworkers that she was in and out of hospitals due to only having one kidney and that she suffered from chronic pain because of what she called a birth defect. In addition to that, she had self-reported that she was diagnosed with pelvic inflammatory disease. Again, nothing on her medical records could be found, not even any mental health records. Chances are, she never went to get help. She probably didn't think she needed help, considering she kept refusing help. Oddly, when I'm reading these DCF reports, and I might be reading them wrong, but recall there were witnesses to the wound on Caleb's foot. A doctor, a school nurse, the school resource officer, teachers. Yet, the DCF report states their findings as follows: not substantiated findings of medical neglect to Caleb, and no indications of inadequate supervision to Caleb, Kylie, Jonathan, Destiny, and Brandon. Really? Are they investigating the right family? The final report regarding Caleb's foot read, "Needs are being seen to with the help of others." What others? The teacher and the resource officer. Is it their responsibility, or was it done because in that case, it's like the helpless being led by the clueless? As they would say, the inmates are running the asylum. Neighbors knew, paramedics knew, school counselors knew, school resource officers knew, yet no one was doing a thing about it. They're just hoping for the best, with minimal voluntary services. It wasn't long before the DCF was back, just a few months later, in January 2013, when Brandon fractured his arm. While he was being examined at the hospital, the X-rays showed Brandon's arm had already been fractured once before, and it wasn't done healing yet. This was a compound fracture, a second fracture to the same arm. I think I could probably guess why his arm was broken, but I'll let you decide what you think happened. Sarah and Jamie were questioned about what happened to Brandon regarding both fractures, and their stories were not consistent with the damage. They blamed it on Don. He was the one outside with Brandon when his arm was injured. A child protection team medical director was now on the case, and because Don was blamed, they recommended, there's that word recommended, can you guess? Voluntary in-home services, no arrests, no removal of the children. What is this? We're not just dealing with a broken arm, we are dealing with a broken system. There's no doubt Sarah did the same thing that she's always done. She minimally participated in the assistance programs, kept abusing drugs, and this resulted in yet another call to DCF in May of 2013, and this was from Jamie's grandmother. So the children's great-grandmother is now calling into the DCF. She tells them that both Destiny and Brandon's teeth are falling out, that they're completely rotten. There was a child protection team from the University of Florida on the case. This time, the University of Florida Child Protection Team, CPT, advised the DCF on what steps they needed to take. Christine had now called the authorities, trying to protect her grandchildren. She told one of the deputies, Don is bipolar, he's not taking his meds, and he's abusing spice. They came in and conducted forensic interviews with all the children. Several of the children expressed fear of Don. When Sarah was interviewed, she told them she had seen guns in the home that belonged to Don, who as a convicted felon was not allowed to have them. The kids said that Jamie would completely wreck the house looking for K2, and if he couldn't find it, he would turn everything over in the entire house. This was heartbreaking. The kids also said, Mom and Dad are drug addicts. For them to even know, understand, and realize that that's what's going on with their parents, it hurt deeply. In the final report, the University of Florida CPT recommended, there's that word again, that Don have no unsupervised contact with his grandchildren, and that Sarah should take classes to become a better parent. They also interviewed people at the school, finding out that Kylie was really struggling. She had to be held back due to chronic lice infestations. The school was working diligently with Caleb, Kylie, and Jonathan, one-on-one, to address the gaps in their academic progress due to excessive absences. But that would soon end, and not for a good reason. The agency administrators had a meeting to decide whether to remove Sarah's children or force her to accept supervision and help from the state. The conclusion in the report read, it was determined there was no reason to seek judicial intervention for compulsory services or ultimately removal from the mother's care because the children were not in imminent danger. In July, just 2 months later, Sarah had failed the Better Parenting program. Ironically, she was about to become a parent for the 6th time. That's right, in September 2013, Sarah found out she was pregnant with her 6th child. By the next month in November, Jamie was in court on a theft charge for attempting to pawn stolen property. He was put on probation until his sentencing hearing, which would be sometime the next year. Sarah and Jamie must have been desperate because Sarah got caught stealing a vehicle. She was convicted of grand theft and put on 18 months of probation. Just probation, with the criminal record she has. Do these agencies even talk to one another? Do they share these reports? Now, Sarah and Jamie are using drugs again while they're on probation. On February 13th, 2013, the day before Valentine's Day, another child had a burn. The school nurse notified DCF, explaining that the burn would have been much better if it had been treated the night before. I think Sarah just wanted to be left alone to do her own thing, so she tried to get Destiny to go to bed, even if she wasn't tired yet. The DCF report stated not substantiated findings of inadequate supervision, therefore no ongoing services were needed. Not needed? I'll tell you what I believe is not needed. All these people and agencies coming in and out of the children's lives who didn't do any good. It's unnecessary to keep sending in people who aren't thoroughly putting the pieces together, who can't even see through the fake smiles and artificial charm, and who were themselves negligent and failed these children. Who is supposed to protect these kids from their own parents? Whose responsibility is it? I was thinking those were the questions that kept me from finishing this research. I kept wondering, when a children's caregiver can't be trusted, who is supposed to step in? The grandparents. What if they can't help? Then who? The state. If it's the state, who are the individuals hired for such a huge responsibility? They're making decisions that can mean life or death. Well, we find out that they weren't the right people in this case. Not at all. Dropping the ball is an understatement. You can tell me at the end why you think the DCF and PSF failed here. But let's move on. I feel like a literal broken record because no other case I've ever done includes this much neglect from so many people. But once again, an incident report in June of 2013 shows the presence of drugs and guns within the home, including filthy living conditions. Let's look at this graphic together. They get a call, that's the first step. And to their credit, it seems the teachers, who hardly get enough recognition for the jobs that they do, were the only ones, besides the neighbors, who probably only called in out of annoyance, that would go out of their way to call and make these reports to the DCF. And I'm thinking, why aren't they calling the police? This graphic here says Florida Child Welfare System, a roadmap to protecting our most vulnerable. Well, it might be a roadmap, but to me it seems like a damn dead end. A phone call, then an investigation to determine whether these allegations are verified. And I would love to see what standard the caseworkers were using at this time to decide whether the allegations were not substantiated or that there were no indications of harm. Those are the two conclusions that don't warrant support. And if you don't pass go, none of the other options around this bend in the roadmap even get triggered. A court case was never opened. The furthest Sarah's cases ever got were to the protective supervision, and there were only 2 or 3 that even reached that far. Though right here, these 2 words, safe or unsafe, why is that determined after a court case is opened? It seems backwards. Sarah failed a number of times, so why was there no case plan put into action? No safe harbor, no foster homes, nothing. Again, they closed the case. Sorry, not sorry that I'm explaining all this because it matters. This is the children's story. This is giving them a voice, and those happy cartoon children upset me when I'm looking at this graphic, honestly. But then again, something really bothered me and confused me because I'm a very observant person. I'm very detail-oriented. I've even read enough cases to spot issues, or so I thought, because I was looking at these photos. And to me, it's true, the children look happy. They look like they're dressed in nice outfits. Caleb played baseball on a team. He obviously had to make it to the practice, make it to the games. That's a big responsibility. Kylie wore beautiful dresses to church. Sarah took cute pictures with her kids. They're in car seats, which obviously means someone was being responsible, because that's the best thing to do. They went on trips to carnivals, riding carousels, on a trip to the beach at night. I think Sarah loved her kids. I believe that there was definitely love in her heart, but not in her actions. Who was taking Caleb to baseball, buying the children nice clothes? Who was doing that? Because from the outside looking in, they look like they're living a pretty normal life. One of Sarah's friends said she had a good heart but was always struggling to keep her life and her children's lives in one piece. She had no job. She couldn't work with all them kids. Every time I turned around, something bad was happening to her. I see what her friend is saying. Sarah lost everyone. Her brother Kyle at a young age, her dad went to prison, her brother Josh was locked up, and soon, both of her children's fathers would be too. When the DCF said the kids were getting care from others, I have to assume it was Christine or the other grandparents. The pictures of Sarah smiling with her kids, it gives me that she's a good mom vibe. Even I'm not seeing the signs, but I wasn't standing in her home knowing all the calls with the allegations supporting them. What has to go on in a home in Florida? Is it death? I guess so. And how many deaths? Sadly, we are about to find out. We're getting closer and closer to the end. Jamie hasn't been sentenced yet. It's now July 24th, 2014. Just a month ago, on June 22nd, Sarah gave birth to her 6th child, Alana. They now have 6 children under the age of 12. 4 of the children are attending Bell Elementary School. When they're at school, it's probably the only time they're treated like human beings, the only place they're truly safe, around people who actually care about them. School, their safe haven. It's a wonder they even made it to school with 2 parents whose driver's licenses are suspended and, obviously, without a vehicle, since we know Sarah tried to steal one. Luckily, they did take the bus. I don't even know how they got to the bus stop in the mornings, but maybe Sarah was still up from the night before doing spice. It is crazy how much people can hide. As they say, you never know what's going on behind closed doors. Unfortunately, the children didn't have their safe haven because they were not in school in July. They were out on summer break with no one to supervise them. The DCF gets a call that all 6 children, including the newborn, were left alone, unsupervised, in Jamie and Sarah's dilapidated shack on his family's property. And where were Jamie and Sarah? They were out looking for more K2. They were now using it on a daily basis. 5-year-old Destiny was reportedly injured while home alone, and one of the kids ran to a neighbor's house to ask for help. The neighbor got a hold of a family member who, according to them, called the DCF. Sarah had been using spice for years, but now it was much more than a recreational drug. It was like a food, a necessity. The way she would feel when she was coming off of it was just too much to handle. People who knew the family said that Sarah acted like the children weren't even there. If she needed to go somewhere and leave the house, she wouldn't even make plans for anyone to care for the children. She would just walk out the door. Caleb was 11 at the time, so I'm sure he took on a lot of the responsibility for his younger siblings, especially his precious newborn sister, Alana. Sarah was arrested on August 26th for violating her probation. Earlier, she had actually stolen $400 from a friend's wallet. Then, her probation officer went to give her a drug test, and she failed it. There's a probationary period until sentencing, so she's released. This report was closed 2 days later on August 28th. One of the investigators, Shelley McDoris, made a final conclusion that the allegations were unfounded. They were just a false report made by that family member because they had a fight with Sarah. According to Sarah, they were just trying to retaliate against her, and Shelley signed off that all the children's needs were being met. The report further went on to state, and you can read it here for yourself, no indicators of inadequate supervision. How would you know if the children are there when you come over? How is that evidence that they weren't alone? Earlier, it says no indicators of substance misuse. Again, how do you know if you're not there when it's happening? How do you know no misuse of illicit drugs? No indicators of physical injury to Destiny? Maybe there weren't any outward signs of injury, but what about mental abuse, psychological, verbal? Do those count? Because I think they should. However, another DCF investigator, Sandra Hodge, tried to explain in her report that this was not a false report. Sarah had admitted to using K2 a couple of weeks ago, back in July, during the case that had just closed. Remember, a year before, she also admitted to it. She said, "Oh, it's not the drugs, it's my medical issues." So they knew. But investigator Hodge went on to note that when she observed the children, they were well-groomed, dressed appropriately for school, and excited to get off the bus and be home with their mom. Luckily, the children were back in school in August when all of this was going on, so at the very least, they got away from these parents during the week. But they were about to get away from Jamie for good. He was finally sentenced in August. This may seem like a good thing, but it's not. It left Sarah with no help. Not that Jamie was that much help, but it was 2 extra hands at least, and now she has no job, no place to stay, and 6 children. She was again knocking on the doors of neighbors' homes, asking for diapers and food for Alana. Of course, the cycle begins once again. The neighbors call the DCF, and yet another case is opened on September 1st. Sadly, this would be the last case, but not for any good reasons. By that time, Sarah was back at Dawn's. She was forced to move back in with him, the man that the University of Florida Child Protection Team recommended the children not have any unsupervised contact with. Not only were Sarah and the 6 kids living at Dawn's in his single-wide trailer, but Colleen's daughter, Katie, was living there too. And guess what? Katie was only 17. and she had a child of her own that was living there as well. Her name was Sophia. She was just under 2 years old, born in March 2013. There were 9 people that we know of living in this small trailer, and Colleen would be over all the time as well. The call on September 1st came after a family member reported that Sarah and Dawn were smoking K2 in front of the children and leaving them unattended. Big surprise. How many reports do you think there had been? By this time, there had been over 18 investigated incidents involving the DCF. 12 years of reports just involving Sarah and her kids, not including all the years that Dawn was the alleged perpetrator in other child welfare incidents. On September 2nd, the Gilchrist County Sheriff's Office did a welfare check at Dawn's home and concluded the children were not in danger. Their police report indicated that they were very familiar with the Spirit family, which may have affected the way these cases were handled. The fact that the family was well known to everyone, from the residents to law enforcement, the school system, DCF, and PSF, may have led them to see this family's reports as the boy who cried wolf, like people were just calling in and there really was nothing wrong. Or was it the same old thing? So much so that they would merely check off a box that it was just another false alarm. No one had died yet, right? So what's there to worry about? Past precedent shows that nothing major has ever happened, so why would you assume it would? Right? Wrong. Again, the agencies thought they knew and understood the family dynamics at play. Essentially, these caseworkers became conditioned to the pattern, so much so that they thought they could predict the future, as if convicted felons on drugs are predictable. Sarah told the DCF investigators she had been released from jail after violating her probation and testing positive for illegal substances. She tells them that the case was open and still being investigated when tragedy struck just 2 weeks later. Dawn seemed to be on edge. He was much angrier than usual. This may have been a result of the spice. He was stressed out over money. Everyone was staying in his trailer. He didn't get along with Colleen. Dawn most likely resented Colleen's nephew, Jamie, who never truly stepped up for his kids. Dawn probably thought that Jamie should have been doing more, but that's the pot calling the kettle black. You're about to find out just how much he hated the Stewart family. Maybe he blamed Jamie for getting Sarah hooked on K2, and then in turn, hating the fact that he was now smoking it too. We will never know the thoughts that were going on in Dawn's head. What we do know is he's getting upset over phone calls that are coming into his cell phone. Sarah didn't have a phone of her own, so she was using Dawn's. He was getting texts from people as well as answering phone calls. We also know that Katie decided to move out of the trailer just a week before the tragedy that occurred on Thursday, September 18th. Katie couldn't take it anymore. There were a variety of factors, but what pushed her over the edge was Dawn's escalating anger. She told people that Dawn was yelling and cussing way too much. He was also off his medication. That's when it seemed like he started becoming enraged. He said he wasn't going to be taking his medicine anymore because it wasn't helping him, and it never had. It's really common for individuals struggling with disorders to believe they're better off without their medication. When they're on the medication, they feel balanced, or they're balanced without knowing it. So this gives them a false sense of reality of what it would be like if they were off their meds. He said, "The medicine I've tried, it ain't working. The one medicine I have is my family." I guess that medication didn't work for Dawn either. One of the issues causing Dawn to become angry was that as soon as Colleen came back into the picture, Sarah began making even worse choices, one of which was to start providing men with sexual favors in exchange for money. Dawn believed this was Colleen's idea. Since we only know what Dawn said, we have no choice but to believe it, and it is safe to assume he knew more than we did. Calls started coming in, either requesting sex or from the man that was helping Sarah get jobs. His name was Jose, and Colleen had introduced him to Sarah. A lot of times, women who will recruit other women into these sex trades get a cut of the money as well, or at least they get a lump sum for bringing in another woman. And that might have been what was going on here. Either way, Dawn believed Colleen was turning Sarah into a whore. His words. Sarah owed her dad money, she was ordered to pay him $100 a month. Plus, I'm sure she needed money for her K2 as well as other necessities. In order to get that money, she started selling her body. All we know about Jose is that he was a Hispanic man from Trenton, Florida. Sarah had only known him for a couple of days. On Tuesday, September 16th, Jose actually shows up at Don's trailer to pick up Sarah. I'm sure Don was there. He didn't work. He was probably helping Sarah watch the kids. Or Sarah could have left all the kids alone, and then maybe Don came home and discovered that. We don't know. But Don knew what Sarah was doing because of the phone. At that time, Sarah only came home with $25. The next day, on Wednesday, September 17th, Colleen was over Don's the entire day. She said that Don was livid, and at one point, Colleen heard him telling Sarah that, quote, "Your kids aren't worth a forwar. Tell someone to come get them because I don't love them, I hate them." Just a short time later, Don apologized to Sarah for making those comments. He said he was just really stressed. Again, Jose reached out, and this time, on the second occasion, Sarah told him to meet her at the dollar store in Bell, probably because she knew Don was going to freak out. When Sarah came back, she had $70 this time. No one knows what went on the rest of the night, what conversations, arguments, or words were exchanged, but what we know is that all four of Sarah's older children, Caleb, Kylie, Destiny, and Jonathan, got on the bus and made it to Bell Elementary School on Thursday morning. We can assume that Sarah was most likely at home that day with Don and the two younger kids, Brandon and Alana. The older kids were set to get off the bus just after 3 p.m., and the school is only about 7 minutes from Don's. Caleb was old enough to walk them to and from the bus stop to the trailer. No one would come and get them off the bus or be waiting for them when they returned from school, although sometimes Don would stand outside the house and yell at the kids in the morning as they were walking to the bus. Neighbors heard this a number of times. They even described him as hating his grandchildren. That Thursday, September 18th, was different. Don was waiting for the kids at the bus stop. When they saw him, they were afraid to get off. Don was known to take bike rides along his street as well as through town. The whole family had suspended licenses, so he rode his bike everywhere he went. That day, around 3:30 p.m., a neighbor named Tate Bryant, who lived at 2870 Northwest 29th Terrace, was home all day. He saw Don walking down the street, which seemed unusual since he only saw Don ride his bike and never walking. He walked up and down the street 3 times, as though he was looking for someone or something. He could tell that Don's body was tensed up. His body language gave off the impression that he was really angry. Brian didn't observe anything else. Don's trailer is the smaller circle, and Mr. Bryant lives at the bigger one. It's about a 6-minute walk. I looked up the school bus route. The bus would stop at the end of 29th Terrace at Northwest 30th Street. A neighbor named Victoria Edwards lives at 2759 Northwest 29th Terrace. She said she saw Don walking to the end of 29th Terrace toward 30th Street to pick the kids up from the bus stop. She echoed what the other neighbor said. She had never seen Don walk the kids back from the bus stop. It takes approximately 9 minutes to walk from the bus stop to Don's trailer. So putting the timeline together, I'm going to assume Don walked the kids inside, then came back out and was walking down the road, seemingly looking for someone or something. Now this is my theory. I think he was looking for Jose. The last 2 days, Sarah had gone somewhere with Jose. He even came to the trailer to pick Sarah up, and Don was not happy about it. I think Don wanted to have some words with Jose and scare him away, because he knew Sarah did not have the willpower to stop. She was going to continue since she was so desperate, and this was quick and easy money. Don may have thought that if Jose knew that Don could possibly hurt him or even kill him, because Don does have guns, according to Sarah, Jose would back off. I think he had his gun on him. Again, this is my theory, but I'm considering this because of how fast things escalated when he got home. I'm assuming he was armed, expecting to come into contact with Jose. The reason I say this is because neighbors Betty and Billy Dyer, who lived at 2720 Northwest 29th Terrace, were coming back home around 3:45 from picking up their granddaughter at school. This timeline matches up with Mr. Bryant's. The couple and their granddaughter were driving south on the roadway and saw a dark-skinned male in his 30s walking down Northwest 29th Terrace, the road in front of Don's trailer. He was just past the neighbor's residence to the north, so he was walking towards Don's. You can see on the map here that the top circle is the Dyers and the bottom one is Don's. But get this, they described him as Hispanic, with dark, medium-length wavy hair and a thin mustache. He had a medium build, and he was fit, so we know this isn't Don. That's not Don's body type. Plus, all the neighbors knew Don. This wasn't Don. The Dyer did not know who this person was. He was not a familiar face. As they looked his way, he was staring back at them in a weird way as they drove by. He actually continued to stare at them, just looking back at them as they drove. I think Don saw a text or got a call from Jose, and he knew that Jose was on his way. Who knows, maybe he actually made contact with Jose, we don't know. But what we do know for sure is that by 4 p.m., Don was on the phone with a 911 operator. To me, I actually truly think he wanted police to come as quickly as possible so that his family's bodies were not found by someone that cared about him or left there to rot. You might disagree with me, that's okay. But I think he did care about his family in some sick way. He just wasn't right in the head. Remember Resource Officer David Adderholt, who took Caleb to the doctor first? Well, sadly, he was the very first person on the scene. Adderholt was near the school when he heard dispatch send a call out. It was a call regarding a person who killed 6 kids and his daughter and would kill himself. Adderholt said he was so familiar with Don and the family and the residents that he just knew. So he rushed over, parked his car on the road outside the trailer, and he could see Don walking near the back portion of the trailer, which is where the entryway was. The front door was broken, and it was permanently sealed. Don was just pacing back and forth, and it didn't look like there were any weapons on him at the time. Adderholt called out to Don by name over his patrol car speaker and identified himself. He told Don to please show him his hands, and Don complied. He put his hands up. Don was cursing, telling the officer he wasn't going to hurt him. And Adderholt wasn't scared of Don at that point. At least not enough to stay covered, because he came out from behind his cruiser so that Don could see him. He wanted to show him he was someone Don knew. After all, this was the officer who took care of his own grandchild a number of times. While Adderholt was speaking with Don, K9 Deputy Scott Douglas arrived on the scene with lights and sirens. He parked behind Adderholt, pulled out his AR, and met him behind the patrol car for cover. Douglas also knew Don, and he listened while Adderholt was trying to convince Don to come talk to them. Don began walking closer to the vehicle, and Adderholt once again told him to show him his hands, which he did. Then Don said, "I'm not mad at you. This is significant, so listen." Don told Adderholt, "I am not mad at you. I'm mad at the Stewarts. Colleen Stewart has turned Sarah into it and drugs, and I'm fed up with this whole family. The Stewart family has ruined my family, they've ruined my life, and I'm tired of them all, and I've taken care of it today." It's a heavy statement. It's a really important one, and it's very telling. Once again, Adderholt asked Don to come to the roadside, but Don just responded with, "I killed them all." Adderholt asked, "Who?" Don replied, "Danielle's the kids inside. I killed the kids inside. They're in the trailer dead, and Sarah's dead too." Adderholt asked where Sarah was, and Don pointed to a tarp on the front lawn close by the driveway. While he was pointing, he screamed something to the effect of, "She's under that right there." Douglas overheard Adderholt tell Don he didn't feel safe with Don near the truck. Don insisted he wasn't there to harm them. He told them he was going to come down to the road. Adderholt asked Don where the weapon was, and he said it was inside. Adderholt knew if that were true, then Don would have to make his way back to the back of the trailer to go get it, so he wanted to keep Don coming forward toward them. Both officers saw Don starting to walk near the back of the trailer, but he stopped and picked up a jug of water, then made his way back to the driveway near his white truck. At that point, when Adderholt attempted to talk to Don, he was way less responsive. Another officer was driving up at this time, They don't know if Don saw these additional officers and started getting scared. Gilchrist County Sheriff Deputy Brittany Lee was the third to respond on the scene. She parked behind the two other cars and made her way behind Douglas's cruiser with her medical kit, her AED, and a patrol rifle. She had Don right in her line of sight, but from where she was standing, she could only see him from the waist up, and it did not seem like he had a weapon in his hand. She reached down, turned the safety off on her rifle, and was ready to fire. Other officers arrived close to the time that Officer Lee arrived. It was Lieutenant Edwin Jenkins, Sergeant Stephen Stalvey, and Sheriff Robert Dale Schultz III. They were right next to Adderholt, trying to formulate a plan as Don walked to the back of his property. Stalvey positioned himself with his rifle ready on the fence line and had binoculars on and could see Don, but not a weapon at this point. Officer Lee was about to raise her weapon and pointed in Don's direction. This is when Adderholt watched on as Don walked back from behind the trailer, returned into view before Officer Lee could take aim, and before Adderholt could say anything to him, a gunshot rang out. There was no echo, it was just a thud. Adderholt shouted that Don had shot himself. Adderholt radioed to dispatch that Don had shot himself and that they needed medical units right away. Sergeant Stephen Stalvey, Lieutenant Jenkins, Lieutenant Jeff Manning, and Officer Douglas formed a line to make their way to the trailer and secure the scene. As he got closer, Deputy Douglas noticed Don was lying on the ground. A wooden-handled .45 caliber handgun was lying at his feet. Crime scene investigator Michelle Jones, now on the scene, is picking up the corner of the tarp next to the driveway, and she asks Adderholt to positively identify the body of Sarah Spirit. He looks underneath and verifies. After this, Adderholt turned around and left the scene, as close as he was to those children. I don't think he could have stomached walking into that crime scene. As they approached Don, Deputy Lee checked for a pulse but found none. He was 51 years old and pronounced dead. Deputy Douglas was the first to walk the crime scene. Right behind him was EMS worker Devin Taylor. Taylor was walking to the scene to check vitals, render aid, or pronounce the victim deceased. Recall that Taylor was the EMT who came to Sarah and Jamie's place when they were high on spice and needed medical attention. I wanted to talk about the directionality of each of these wounds, but unfortunately I don't think I'm going to be able to go into that detail. Just know that this was a very horrific crime scene. If you want to use your own imagination, I'm sure you can come up with a mental picture. She was just inside the doorway. The little girl was identified as Kylie Marie Coleman, 9 years old. Taylor pronounced her dead, and they made their way down the hall. This is not Don's real trailer, but I found this floor plan and wanted to show it so that you can see what a trailer like this looked like, and also how they made their way through and where they found everyone. Only a few feet away, they found the body of a preteen boy. He was dressed in a short-sleeved shirt, shorts, and sneakers. He was pronounced dead and identified as Caleb Coleman, 11 years old. They made their way into the main portion of the trailer, which was the living area. The trailer was a mess. It was in complete disarray. Despite the usual mess, there were signs of a struggle. They could see into the kitchen since it was sort of all one room, and the refrigerator was lying on its side. It takes a lot of force to push over a refrigerator. Sergeant Stalvey made his way to the couch. It was obvious to them that she showed no signs of life. This was 10-week-old Alana Stewart, so sick and so heartbreaking. Special Agent Watts and Deputy Lee were leading the officers into the north bedroom. When they entered, they saw the body of a little girl on a futon. She was identified as Destiny Stewart, just 5 years old. Next to her at the foot of the futon was the body of a young boy, and Deputy Lee remarked that it appeared he was trying to hide. This poor boy was trying to hide in plain sight because there was nowhere for him to go. He was identified as Brandon Stewart, only 4 years old. A sweet little baby boy. Why would anyone do that? Sergeant Stalvey walked to the other end of the trailer and entered the south bedroom. Lying on the floor right in the doorway was the body of Jonathan Coleman, 8 years old. It was apparent to Sergeant Stalvey, as well as all the other personnel on scene, that no one had survived their injuries. They exited the trailer and deemed it safe and secure for forensics to proceed. When Deputy Lee exited, she was asked by Lieutenant Jenkins to check under the tarp and verify the identity and vitals of the victim. Lee removed the tarp, revealing Sarah's spirit lying on her stomach. Lee placed the tarp back over Sarah as they made their way back to the patrol cars. As they made their way back to the patrol cars, Special Agent Watts and Sheriff Schultz saw Sarah's mother, Christine. She was outside on the roadway in front of the trailer. At that time, they had the unbelievably difficult task of informing her about the death of an entire family. I actually can't imagine. I was trying to imagine it. I don't want to imagine it, but the horror, sadness, disbelief, and emotional wreck that Christine must have been in, it must have been overwhelming. Police said that because of her emotional state, she could not give them much information. All she could say was that Don was bipolar, and, to her knowledge, he was using illegal narcotics. She hadn't spoken to Sarah since last week, but knew that Sarah was living with Don just until she could save enough money to rent a place of her own. I have so many mixed emotions, and when I read this, my heart ached for Christine, but it also ached for Sarah. Those last moments, knowing full well you are never going to see your babies again. It wasn't a quick death, and I'll tell you why in just a moment, because I have the autopsy reports. As much as I want to hate Sarah, I still want to cry for her. Just reading the part about Christine saying that she knew Sarah was just trying to save money so she could rent her own place. It just hurt, and maybe she was just working for drugs. But a part of me truly believes that she was hoping that somehow she could pull herself out of this mess. When this small town heard about what happened, you could have guessed it tore the residents apart. Grief counselors were sent to Bell Elementary and surrounding schools. The next night on Friday, the victims were honored with a balloon release by the captains from Bell and Trenton High School before their big football game. The fans were asked to wear white in solidarity. A woman named Danielle Berry said that she grew up in Bell and went home early from work so she could wear something white and show her support. She said, "Never live for tomorrow because tomorrow isn't promised." A friend of Sarah's, named Casey Hart, was saddened by the loss and wanted everyone to know that Sarah was a busy mom who loved to laugh and watch comedies. She went on to say that Sarah's poor mother, Christine, had lost her youngest son, her oldest daughter, and all of her grandchildren. I found a picture because I like to look and know what these people look like. We see all the children, but I didn't know what Christine looked like, and I searched forever. I found her Facebook, and this is her with all her grandbabies before the tragedy. You can tell she just loved them so much. I mean, who wouldn't? They're adorable, innocent kids. It's even hard for these grown men to talk about. Lieutenant Jeff Manning had a hard time containing his sadness during the second press conference that night. Remember I told you that Sarah didn't die a quick death? Her autopsy showed she was barefoot and had blunt force trauma to the back of her head. She may have been pistol whipped. There was a laceration on her head, as well as 6 stab wounds to her midsection. Remember that Don had pushed Sarah against the refrigerator once before. We can assume he did this again after becoming enraged over Josie. He probably had that anger still inside him, not able to let it out on Jose. He goes back inside, and he and Sarah most likely got into a fight. I just think things happened too fast. He comes inside, pushes her against the fridge, they fight, he grabs a knife and starts to stab her in the chest. She runs out the back door to go get help. She makes her way down to the front, and remember, her head when she falls is pointing towards the road. So, you know she was probably running toward the road, and that's when he shot her. She fell where she stood. Then he realized what he had done. Now Sarah was gone. Did he really intend to kill all of them that day? I don't think so. I don't think he premeditated this. But I think it hit him in that moment when he realized he had just killed his daughter. Now all those kids would be left without a mother, and he would be spending the rest of his life in prison or get death himself. The kids already had no fathers, and clearly Don hated the rest of the family, so he figured I'm just going to end it, and he said he took care of it that day. Then I think he just turned back towards the door of the trailer. Kylie heard the commotion and probably went to check on her mom. and as she came through that door, he shot her. Then he just made his way all around that home, shooting each and every child one by one. The first Gilchrist County deputy arrived and saw an unarmed Spirit pacing in his backyard. The report says he told the deputy a relative of his daughter's boyfriend got her into prostitution and drugs. Spirit then said, quote, "I'm fed up with this whole family. They have ruined my life, and I'm tired of them all, and I've taken care of it today." I also want you to see the gravestones. It's so heartbreaking. Look at these gravestones. I've never seen anything like that, ever. They're so beautifully done. We had a lot of failures with local government agencies, particularly the DCF, Department of Children and Family Services. There were a lot of failures going on, and there's no way that these kids should have ever been living anywhere near that monster. Former neighbors who have known or lived next to him throughout the years in Bell and in Tampa describe him as being just human filth. That's the mother, Sarah, with her brother Kyle, and my 3-month-old baby right there, Alana. There are so many people who conclude that these murders happened just because Don was angry at Colleen, and that bothers me. Without knowing the whole story, that's just a part of what led up to these horrific deaths. Sarah had a choice. Don had a choice. Don killed these kids. It's Don's fault. You might be wondering why fathers, or in this case grandfathers, kill their families and themselves. David Wilson of Birmingham City University actually divided this logic that these people have into 4 types: the anomic, disappointed, self-righteous, or paranoid. The anomic killer sees his family as a status symbol. When his economic status collapses, he sees them as a burden because now he has nothing. The disappointed killer seeks to punish his family for not living up to the ideals of what a family should be in his perspective. The self-righteous killer destroys the family for revenge upon the mother. Finally, the paranoid killer kills their family because they imagine they are protecting them from something even worse. Which one do you think Don was? One last thing that I think you'll be happy to know is that the DCF had to pay a settlement for their inaction regarding these children. They actually conducted their own investigation first, deploying a critical incident response team to assess the nature and efficacy of the DCF's involvement. They wanted to evaluate potential systemic issues within the local system of care. I read all of it, and it was laughable, in my opinion. Some of the worst parts seemed to try to justify their inaction. Statements like this: "There is no evidence to suggest that anyone at any time could have known that Don Spirit was capable of the premeditated and intentional massacre of his 6 grandchildren, his daughter, and then himself." They stated, "There will never be one child who dies without DCF working to determine what changes can be made or processes improved to prevent further tragedy." Really? DCF administrators insisted that there was nothing in the 8-year history with the Spirit family that could have predicted this outcome. Oh, and this one was even worse. They showed a chart depicting only 4 deaths between 2009 and 2013. However, the Miami Herald was doing its own private investigation for years, digging through 6 years of DCF files and finding hundreds of children who died from abuse or neglect while working with the DCF. Sarah's children were added to the list of 534 children that had prior DCF history who will never get the chance to grow up. Without going into any more detail than I already have, the DCF and 2 private companies connected to it agreed to pay $750,000 to settle the legal claims that arose from Don's killing spree. DCF paid $450,000, Partnership for Strong Families paid $250,000, and DeVaro paid $50,000. The money went to the victims' estates. Some may conclude something good came out of these deaths, that changes were made to legislation and that more children will be protected because of this. I don't see it like that. I can't. None of these children had to die to protect others. Others should have protected them so they didn't have to die. Imagine you're 5 months pregnant, you're 2 months away from marrying the love of your life, you've just got a new home, you're working at your dream job, and you're driving home from work when everything you know and love is taken away from you, and your life is cut short, revealing deep, dark secrets. Now let's get into the case for today. Today, I get to tell you about the most kind-hearted, gentle, hardworking woman that I've had the pleasure to learn about, Avis Marie Banks. She was born on August 18, 1979, to Frederick and Deborah Banks. Fred and Deborah grew up in western Mississippi. They bought a home together in Vicksburg, which is a smaller city along the east bank of the Mississippi River, with a population of about 25,000 people. Vicksburg was a great place for Fred and Deborah to start a family. It was close to their relatives, it had a cute historic vibe, a great school district, and a supportive church community, and it's only about an hour's drive away from Jackson, the state capital. Living in Vicksburg, Mississippi is a unique experience. It's full of Southern charm, history, and culture. The streets are lined with towering oak trees and antebellum mansions. Vicksburg is a place where the past and the present collide, and where residents take pride in their heritage. On any given day, you can find Vicksburg residents enjoying a stroll through the Vicksburg National Military Park, visiting the Old Courthouse Museum, or catching a show at the Vicksburg Theater Guild. Living in Vicksburg is also about savoring the simple things in life. It's about sitting on your porch swing on a warm summer night, listening to the crickets chirp and the river roll by. It's about enjoying a delicious home-cooked meal with family and friends, and it's about taking the time to appreciate the beauty of the world around you. The Banks had a cute little coin home with a porch out front, perfect for a rocking chair to sit on during those southern afternoons and evenings. Deborah and Fred both came from families who valued hard work and supported each other unconditionally. Fred was working as a street sweeper, helping the city of Vicksburg stay clean and safe to live in. Deborah was a full-time mom, and she was also the go-to babysitter for all their neighbors and relatives. They both worked very hard to provide for their family. Fred would provide for all their needs, and the money that Deborah brought in would be saved for special vacations or activities. They welcomed their first daughter, Latada Banks, in September of 1975. Then, when Deborah got pregnant with Avis about 4 years later, Latada was so excited to have a sister. Avis was born in 1979, and she was a quiet, happy baby, just a cutie pie. Later, in August 1985, Avis and Latada welcomed another sister, Frena Banks, and then the sisterhood was complete. This is a gorgeous family, and growing up, the Banks sisters did everything together. They shared clothes, brought boys over, laughed together, sometimes fought, but they had fun. Avis and Frena were particularly close. They were best friends. They would talk about their future, how they both wanted kids around the same age who would one day play together, and Avis was very protective of her younger sister. Avis's mother said she loved all her children, but Avis was different. She was a perfect child, and there was something about her, something that was different from the beginning. And I was wondering, do you think that parents have favorites? I've always heard that they do, but I only have one child, so I don't know if that's possible. But I've heard it is, so let me know in the comments what you think. Avis valued education, and there was a time when she brought home her report card that was all A's and 1 B, and she was crying. Frena was concerned because she got B's and wondered if that was bad, but Avis just had high standards for herself. When she and Frena would play school, Avis was always the teacher, and she would love to read to her little sister and teach her everything and anything she could. She also put others before herself all the time, especially her little sister. She would let her win at games they'd play because she wanted to boost her confidence, and she always made sure Frena was taken care of. The same went for Avis's friends. If they were ever in need, she would be the first to step up and offer something of her own to help them out, even if it was to her detriment. Every Sunday, the family attended Locust Grove Missionary Baptist Church, where the sisters learned to put their faith first. Fred raised his daughters to be smart and conscientious. When Latada went to high school and started hanging out with boys, Fred totally went into protective dad mode. He made sure all the boys had only the best intentions for his daughters. They knew how he expected a man to treat them, and Fred would be there to make sure they were treated well. As Avis got older, she had a really close relationship with her dad. Fred called her his little hero. By the time she attended Warren Central High School, Avis was a huge bookworm and dedicated to her studies. While other kids in high school were starting to experiment with alcohol and other substances, Avis loved nothing more than staying home and hanging out with her mom, dad, and sisters while she read a book. She always had a book with her. If the family was watching TV, Avis still had a book out, reading while taking a peek at the TV every now and then. It's like she always wanted to feel productive. She also loved spending time with her extended family and taking care of younger kids, especially babies. When Avis graduated from high school in 1997, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life: work with kids and have kids of her own one day. It was around the same time that her older sister, Latata, moved out of the family home. This gave Avis and Frina a chance to become even closer, but they still spent time with Latata. As a matter of fact, she would come get her younger sisters, and they'd spend the weekends at her place, going shopping, out to eat, and having fun girl time. That summer, in June, Fred and Deborah saved enough money to take Frina and Avis on a trip to Disney World. They drove 730 miles, and while Deborah started the trip driving, Fred was right there in the passenger seat documenting everything on his camcorder. Avis was shy. She didn't like being the center of attention or being on camera, so as Fred turned to face the girls in the back seat, 17-year-old Avis covered herself up. Meanwhile, 12-year-old Frina was just asleep without a care in the world as they made that 11-hour drive. And when they got to the park, Fred again whipped out the camcorder and recorded the girls as they rode roller coasters, screaming and laughing, and having the time of their lives together. Avis preferred to take any photos they had and make scrapbooks for everyone. She wanted to be able to look back on all of these special moments. She would spend hours creatively putting them together, and you could tell how much the Banks family loved one another. Fred cared so deeply about his wife and his girls. He had tears in his eyes when his eldest got married. He walked Latata down the aisle, and as she began to cry, he patted her gently, showing that he was there by her side. Avis and Frina looked beautiful. They were just cherishing this special moment with their sister and family. Their hair was done perfectly. Their makeup was on point. Everything was perfect. So, it's hard to imagine that tragedy would strike before Fred's second daughter would ever walk down the aisle. Frina said this was her favorite picture of her and Avis together at Latata's wedding. They were so happy. But she recalls that neither of them had any plans of their own to get into a serious relationship, at least not yet. Avis really wanted to get her education first. She wore a beautiful gold dress since she was the maid of honor, and she looked absolutely gorgeous. When they say that someone could light up a room, I'm aware that it's very cliché. We hear it in so many true crime videos, but I'm always going to remember seeing Avis in this dress when someone says a person lit up a room, because this is what they mean. There was just a presence about her. You would know she was there, even if she wasn't trying to be noticed. The big smile, the high cheekbones, and her gentle, sweet nature made her stand out. After high school, Avis enrolled in Hines Community College in Vicksburg, and when she graduated in May of 1999, guess who made sure he charged the camcorder to capture the memorable moment? Yes, Fred. There he was, documenting the entire day from the minute they stepped foot out of the house until Avis walked across that stage. Frina remembers him being more excited about Avis graduating than she was. He was so proud of her. It reminds me so much of my own dad, and I'm sure many of you can relate. There's someone in your family that probably does this, or maybe you do it with your kids. But Avis Marie Banks received her diploma, graduating cum laude. She had told her family to please not clap for her, but they couldn't hold back. Later, Deborah told her daughter that of course she was going to holler. She was going to let it be known that that was her daughter walking across the stage. It just goes to show you how much pride and joy Avis's family had for her. After this, she enrolled at Alcorn State University in Jackson, Mississippi, not too far from her parents, but far enough away that she could be more independent. She was majoring in child development, and over the next few years she got to experience the exciting and life-changing chapter that college is. In Jackson, there were more people to meet, places to shop, and things to do. But still, Avis was more introverted, so she didn't go out that much. That meant she could put more time and energy into her classes. She ended up graduating with honors in 2001, receiving her bachelor's degree in childhood development. She was the first person in her family to graduate from a university with a bachelor's degree, and her mom, dad, and sisters were so proud of her. Avis decided after graduating that she had a couple of important goals for her life. First, she wanted to open her own daycare. She absolutely adored children and was really passionate about making daycare affordable for parents in need. She spent her early 20s talking to her father all the time about her plan and trying to figure out how she could make this dream a reality. She actually wanted to open 2 daycares, one that would be owned as a family and the other that would be hers. Both would provide low or no-cost childcare to underprivileged children and families struggling to make ends meet. Many parents face difficulties finding an affordable daycare that actually offers a quality education to their children. She was determined to bridge that gap and make her daycare center accessible. You can tell how much Avis respected her family. She wanted to make sure that if she became successful, she could also make sure to take care of her family and ensure they had something to benefit from as well by opening up that second daycare. After all, they had helped her achieve her goals as she was growing up. Avis's second goal was to have children of her own, and of course, she wanted to be swept off her feet. It's true, Avis wanted a husband and a family one day, but she had set her standards high. She wanted someone who was on her level when it came to earning potential and education, someone with the same values who was dedicated to success. She knew all that would come in time, but at the moment, she decided to get a job as an assistant director for a local daycare. This would give her the experience she needed to go out on her own in the future, and she had plans to obtain her master's degree while putting her other goals into motion. Avis had moved back to Vicksburg and continued to spend a lot of time with her younger sister while working at the daycare. She would excitedly talk about all the babies whenever she got a chance. She specialized in children under 2. One evening in early 2004, Avis, who was 24 at the time, and Frina were at the local gym together. Something that they did on a regular basis, but this time, while they were working out, this very charismatic young man approached Avis. He had these piercing eyes, short-cut hair, was well-groomed, and had a nice smile. Most of all, he had this air of confidence about him. He asked Avis if she would mind speaking with him for a moment. Ferdina, jokingly thinking, yes, we mind, because she was very protective of Avis and never thought anyone was good enough for her perfect sister. But Avis decided to step away and give this gentleman a chance to speak with her. He introduced himself as Keon Pittman and said he also lived in Vicksburg. They started talking, and Avis thought, you know what? I kind of like this guy. They had a lot of things in common. Keon had also gone to Alcorn State University, but he was 29, 4 years older than Avis, so they had not run into each other in college. But they were both living comfortably in Vicksburg and loved it there. Keon also loved kids. He was actually teaching in a public school in Tallulah, Louisiana, which is about a 30-minute drive from Vicksburg, and he was really passionate about fitness and living a healthy lifestyle. All of this appealed to Avis, so she exchanged numbers with him. Then, when she got back to her sister after chatting for about 10 minutes, Ferdina, of course, wanted to know how it went and what he had to say. Avis said, "Oh, not much, we just talked," but she could tell that Avis was excited. And it was true. After meeting Keon, she couldn't stop talking about him. The connection between them was strong. She would share stories with her family about their conversations and their interests. Eventually, Avis agreed to go on a date with Keon, and then another and another. Avis was smitten. It was clear to everyone around her that she had fallen in love. And Keon? He was a charmer. He's been described as not quite the looker, but very charismatic. However, when it came to why Keon fell for Avis, it was kind of obvious for those on the outside. She was beautiful, of course, there's more to her, but, at first glance, her skin was glowing, she had the cutest little nose, and she had these super expressive eyes. Just by looking at her, you could tell she also had a kind soul. She wore her hair straight a lot. but when she would let her natural curls out, she was absolutely stunning. Everyone considered Avis to be this gentle, sweet sunflower. She had this very positive, bright energy to her, and she was willing to give to other people all the time. Everyone who loved her just hoped that she would find someone who loved her just as much. When Fred and Deborah met Keon, they really liked him. He was college educated, he had a good job, he took care of himself, had great manners, and valued everything Avis valued. I think this is a great time to tell you a little more about Keon's life. He'd grown up in Picayune, Mississippi, a town close to New Orleans, and he visited his family on a regular basis. Keon graduated from Alcorn State with 3 degrees, including biology, PE, and health sciences. He planned to go to medical school, but after he started looking into it, he realized it was going to be pretty rough on his mental health, so he embarked on a teaching career. He was still interested in natural medicine, and he enjoyed basketball. Fred had a high opinion of Keon. He called him a great provider and the son he never had, and Avis adored him. Fred and Deborah knew how much Keon meant to Avis, and they were so excited to see their daughter happy. It was a match made in heaven, and after a year, they were still going just as strong. Then Avis and Keon revealed they were moving in together. For Fred and Deborah, this was exciting but a little bittersweet. Keon had gotten a job offer in Jackson, Mississippi, which was about a 50-minute drive. This job paid a lot better than his current one, so Keon was going to be working as a 6th grade science teacher at Chastain Middle School, and he would also be the boys' basketball coach over the winter, which paid a little extra. Avis decided it would be best for her life journey to move in with him and scope out job opportunities together. They bought a brand new home in Ridgeland, a suburb in Jackson with a population of about 20,000 people. They moved into the house at the tail end of 2005 when Avis was 26 and Keon was 30. The house was in a cute, safe neighborhood called the Blackthorn subdivision at the far end of Lincolnshire Boulevard. It sat at 708 Old Square Court. It was a 3-bedroom house with a garage and a quiet neighborhood without many trees, but a nice big yard. It's located on a cul-de-sac. The housing in this area was affordable, and the neighborhood consisted of new couples who were starting to raise their families. It was also the perfect distance for Keon to drive to work. He preferred to commute, and it was only about a 25-minute drive from the middle school. To help bring in even more income, Keon got a part-time bartending job in his off time. This was at a Mexican restaurant called On the Border Mexican Cantina, which wasn't far from the middle school, only about 8 minutes. So for a few days after school each week, he would pick up shifts for some extra cash, and you can't beat the tips you get when you're bartending or serving. That summer, Avis was excited to come to Chastain Middle School to help Keon prepare his classroom for the incoming 6th graders. He introduced one of his colleagues to Avis, and she recalled how beautiful this lady was. Just gorgeous. Avis also remembered how Keon's eyes lit up when he introduced them. He made it known right away that Avis was his girlfriend, and you could tell how happy they were together. While all of this was going on, and they were settling in, Avis was still holding on to her dream of owning her own daycare. Her dad had even driven up from Vicksburg a couple of times to help her look at rental spaces where she could open up her own company. She was really serious about starting her own business, but life was getting busy. After the move in 2005, Avis landed a 9-to-5 job at Bright Horizons Daycare, a company that provided daytime childcare to Blue Cross Blue Shield employees. She worked Monday through Friday and had the weekends free. She specifically worked with babies and children under 2. According to Avis's boss, she was a wonderful employee, quiet, always on time, got along with everyone, valued teamwork, and was an absolute natural when it came to taking care of kids. Avis's boss was not the only one who had glowing reviews. In March of 2006, Avis and Keon got new neighbors when Johnny Coleman and his kids moved in next door. Avis and Keon stopped by to introduce themselves. Johnny said they were super welcoming and friendly and that they seemed like a very happy couple. He said Avis was very soft-spoken and introverted but pleasant to be around. She spent a lot of time in her house, and her favorite moments were spent having quality time at home with Keon and her family. In August 2006, Avis had some big news. She found out that she was pregnant. They weren't planning on this happening right away, but they both agreed they definitely wanted kids and were excited to be expecting. Fredina remembers the day she found out she was going to be an aunt. Avis called one morning and their mother answered the phone. Fredina was close by and could hear her mother excitedly asking questions. She wanted to know what was going on, so Deborah handed the phone to her youngest daughter, and Avis asked her, "Are you sitting down?" That's when she told her sister she was going to be an auntie. This was going to be Fredina's first niece or nephew, so she was very excited. When Fred and Deborah found out, they were overjoyed, but the truth is they weren't really that happy about the fact that their daughter was having a child out of wedlock. So they did put a little pressure on Avis and Keon to get married. This was fine with Avis. She was 27 now and down to get married at any time. Keon was really excited. He told all of his co-workers the big news, and one of them asked him if wedding bells were coming soon. That's when he kind of shyly said, "Oh, I know where you're going with that question. Yes, we're gonna get married soon." Keon did end up proposing to Avis that fall, and they set their wedding date for a few months later, in the new year, mid-January 2007. That way, maybe she wouldn't be showing as much. She would only be about 6 months pregnant, and everything was falling into place. But life was continuing to get busier for the couple, and they were experiencing the stress of balancing all the parts of their lives. In August, Keon started the new school year at Chastain Middle School. Every day, he left for work at 7 a.m., got out of school at 3:30, ran some errands, went back to school, and then coached the basketball team. He would finally get home around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. On the evenings and weekends when he wasn't coaching, he was working his part-time bartending job. On those nights, he would come home even later, but he was putting in the work to pay for their wedding, and of course, their new baby coming soon. Avis was super busy herself. Not only was she excitedly planning a wedding and a space for their new baby in their home, but she was still working full-time, doing housework, spending time with her parents, and planning to open her own daycare, all while being pregnant, going to all her appointments, experiencing morning sickness, cravings, you name it. By November of 2006, her baby bump was just starting to show through her clothes, and she was exhausted. Excited to be a mom, but exhausted. She did find out the baby's gender. It was a boy, and she and Keon had already decided on a name, Kellen. Avis and Keon told their families about the new baby's name over Thanksgiving break, when they traveled to Picayune to visit Keon's family, as well as to Houston to spend time at Deborah's for Thanksgiving dinner with Avis's family. But at both celebrations, Keon was acting a bit strange. While Avis was hanging out with his mom, Keon was gone for hours from the home. At Deborah's house, Keon was on his phone all the time. He seemed really absent from the conversations and would go outside to take phone calls, which, if you ask me, is a little sketchy. Why can't you just have the phone call in front of everyone else at dinner? Fred noticed that Avis was feeling some type of way about Keon's behavior. He said, "I remember Avis was just sitting across from him, and he walked by on his phone. Avis kind of looked at him, gave him a little look." It's hard to know what she was thinking during Thanksgiving break, but obviously, Keon had a lot going on. When the family asked him what was up, he said he was having some family issues and was speaking to his mother. Avis's family totally understood, but Keon was always a little bit sketchy, like you couldn't quite tell if something else was going on or who he was talking to. He had a lot of friends. Fred and Deborah knew that Avis was head over heels for him. She trusted him. But they started to wonder if Keon returned those feelings completely. He was charismatic, but he was definitely flaky. Still, since they trusted Avis, they trusted her judgment. The last time Fred and Deborah saw Keon and Avis together was the Sunday after Thanksgiving. They drove up to Ridgeland to spend time with their daughter and help her decorate her house for Christmas. Fred helped Keon put up those hanging icicle lights from the roof. They lit up all these candy canes right in front of the porch area and had a Christmas tree made of a swirling strand of lights in the front yard. Avis invited her family over for Christmas, and they were looking forward to going to church and spending the rest of the holidays together. But I want to fast forward to Wednesday, November 29th. When Avis was getting off work, she got a call from Keon at 5:12 p.m. He told her he was on his way to basketball practice and that he'd see her later. She left the Bright Horizons location on Lakeland Drive at 5:15 p.m., feeling tired after a long day. At 5:36, she gave Keon another call. She asked about his plans for dinner, and he said he'd take care of everything when he got home from basketball practice. Satisfied with his answer, Avis drove the rest of the way to their house. She stopped in front of it to pick up the mail from the mailbox. This was her usual routine. She would drive up, get out of her car, check the mail, then get back in her car and drive up to their garage. She would open the garage door with the remote in her car, drive inside, and then make sure the garage door was completely shut before getting out. She was pretty street smart and always made sure to be safe, acknowledging her surroundings in case something happened. Well, something did happen. Something horrible and devastating. Keon's whereabouts over the course of the night are all over the place, and I'll get into that later. But one thing is certain. When Keon got home around 8:30 that evening, he opened the garage door and found his pregnant fiancée collapsed next to her Honda Accord. Avis was lying right next to the driver's door in a large pool of blood that was trailing down the slope of the garage floor toward the driveway. She was still wearing her work scrubs, along with a light jacket, and her keys were clenched in her hand, showing that she had been attacked as soon as she got out of her car. Avis's purse and some of the pieces of mail were scattered all around her body. Keon ran to Avis. He tried waking her up, hugging her, shaking her, crying, and even kissed her on the lips. But sadly, she was gone. She had already passed away. Keon noticed that her pants had been pulled down, and his heart just broke in an absolute flood of emotion. Keon raced into the house and all around it, trying to see if the culprit was still on the scene. There was no one to be found. The house was a disaster. There were papers everywhere, drawers opened. It was completely ransacked. It looked like Avis and Keon were the victims of a burglary gone wrong. Keon raced back to his fiancée's body, and this is where things get weird. Instead of calling 911 from his cell phone, which he had on him, he frantically ran to the neighbor's house and started banging on their door. The couple who lived next door had no idea what was happening. All they saw was this man running, knocking, and yelling at the top of his lungs, trying to get into their house. The woman picked up her phone and dialed 911. On this recording, the neighbor begins to make her noise complaint, saying that there's this man outside hollering and banging on her door, and she told the operator that he was running from door to door doing the same thing in the neighborhood. But while on the line, she looks out the window and realizes she recognized him. She tells the operator she thinks it's her neighbor, so she sends her husband out there to go check. That's when she hears her husband yell, "Call 911. She said, "Why? What is going on?" And her husband yelled, "Somebody killed his wife." In a panic, this woman relayed to the operator that their neighbor said someone killed his wife. Keon went back to where Avis was lying and remained there until the police showed up. He also called Deborah for a second time that night. The first time had been when Keon was driving home from basketball practice. He had called Deborah around 8:31 to say Avis wasn't picking up her phone, and he was really worried about her. He wanted to know if Deborah had heard from Avis in the past few hours. Deborah thought that was very out of character for Keon, because he had never called to say he was concerned about Avis before. Maybe she was watching her favorite TV show, or she fell asleep. So when Deborah got another call from Keon around 8:45, she picked it up, wondering what he was going to say now. On the other end of the line, he was screaming and his words were jumbled. She said, "Keon, what is going on? Where's Avis? He just said that she and Fred needed to get over to Ridgeland now. Something happened to Avis." I can only imagine what was going on in Fred and Deborah's minds when they got that call. They were preparing for bed on a Wednesday night in the middle of a long work week, and they get this call from their future son-in-law saying that it's urgent and to come over now. They fluctuated between panic and confusion, and thoughts were whirling around in their minds. Was Avis hurt? Did she fall? Was the baby okay? Deborah suspected it must be a miscarriage. She knew it was imperative that she'd be there for her daughter to support her through one of the most heartbreaking things that can ever happen to a woman, if that was the case. But it turned out to be much worse. Ferdina heard her mother screaming from the other room as she was in the middle of giving her baby son a bath. She was alarmed, so she asked, "What is going on?" Deborah simply handed Ferdina the phone and said, "It's Keon. He's saying something's wrong with Avis." Ferdina got on the phone, and again, Keon repeated what he told Deborah, that they needed to get over there now. Ferdina was like, "For what? What's going on?" But Keon just hung up. Deborah, Fred, Ferdina, and her baby jumped into the car, and they drove the 55 miles east to the Jackson suburbs. When they pulled up to Old Square Court, Avis's family was anticipating her house to be lit up by Christmas lights on the dark, quiet street, and it was lit up with Christmas lights but also with police lights as well. Ferdina just remembers seeing a bunch of cops, an ambulance, and yellow police tape around Avis's home. There were a bunch of neighbors along the edge of the property who were trying to figure out what was going on. Deborah walked slowly up to the house. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. As soon as Fred saw that crime scene tape, he knew in his gut that something really bad had happened to Avis, and that nothing would ever be the same. As they joined the crowd around the house, they ran into Keon, who was just screaming and crying, not making any sense. Ferdina was like, "Keon, you gotta get up and you gotta tell us what's going on." But he was unable to speak. Finally, it was the coroner who came up to the family and said in these words, "Your daughter is deceased. She died a horrible death." Wow, how absolutely devastating those words are. There's no good way to deliver that kind of news, and it is the truth. Fred and Deborah lost their beloved middle daughter and the grandson they were so excited to meet. Avis was 5 months pregnant. Her unborn baby was a victim of this vicious murder as well. From their vantage point, Avis's mom and dad could see their future son-in-law sitting in a cop car, and they were confused as to why. They figured he was just going to be questioned so they could figure out what happened to Avis. Because of course he wouldn't be involved, right? He couldn't be. He was like a son to the Banks family, but we know that most women are sadly killed by someone close to them, and who was closer to Avis than Keon. All they could do was wait. So let's go back to the crime scene. Investigators had arrived at 8:46 p.m. and found Keon hovering over Avis's body, with blood all over his hands, pants, and shirt. Lieutenant Neal and Detective Frank Dillard of the Ridgeland Police Department immediately took steps to secure the crime scene and figure out what happened. They told Keon he needed to back up, but Keon didn't want to leave Avis's side. It took a lot of convincing to get him to wait in that patrol car. Then the paramedics arrived, confirming that Avis had passed away, as well as her unborn son. Avis had been shot, and one of the bullets had missed, hitting the bottom left corner of the garage door. There was a hole right through it. But that wasn't all. A knife or sharp-bladed object had been used to stab her multiple times, and she was slashed across her throat. There were no signs of a struggle. It appeared that everything happened so fast that Avis was in shock when she passed away. It didn't seem like she saw this coming at all. And what kind of monster could have done this? We know Avis. She spent her time working hard, being with her family, and giving back to others. So who in the world would want to hurt such a lovely person? Lieutenant Neal looked over the crime scene. First, they started looking in the garage for evidence. They found that bullet hole in the garage door, but when they tried to look for shell casings, it turns out there were none. So either all these shells had been meticulously and carefully picked up from the floor, or a revolver had been used, because they don't leave empty cartridges behind. They remain in the cylinder. They did a walkthrough of the home and realized someone had slammed the back door open with such force that the doorknob dented the wall. It left an impression. Lieutenant Neal wondered if this was a sign of anger, or if the perpetrator was just in a hurry to get into that house. They also found Avis's blood on the wall between the garage and the house, as well as on a light switch near the back door. They found several really important pieces of evidence. To get into the house, the perpetrator had walked past the garage door to the back door, which had a glass panel on it. They attempted to force it open by kicking it, leaving dirty shoe prints behind on the glass. They were able to measure the prints, took pictures of them, and lifted them from the glass. After analyzing them, they determined that they were men's size 8 shoes. The forensic team also noticed they had a very distinctive tread pattern, so they made sure to document the prints carefully to analyze them and try to match them if any other shoes were found in this investigation. This is where it gets really interesting. The house was a mess, which made sense for a burglary or robbery, but there was nothing missing from the house. Expensive jewelry, electronics, and other easily pawnable items were all left behind. Detective Neal said that the house did not look right to veteran officers. Someone had unplugged all the electronic devices and stacked them up, but they didn't steal a single one. Then they went to the main bedroom, opened every other drawer in the dresser, and rummaged through them. He said they even went into the bathroom and did the same thing to the bathroom cabinets, every drawer. Lieutenant Neal had never seen a robber go through a bathroom like that, because people don't usually keep their valuable items in the bathroom. So what was this perpetrator looking for? How close were they to Avis that they could have known where to look in her bathroom for something? That's when they started to question whether the scene was staged. Lieutenant Neal also took notice that Avis's scrub pants had been pulled down, and it was easy to jump to conclusions. But there were no signs of a struggle. Since the robbery seemed staged, he wondered if this could be staged as well. In Neal's 20 years as a detective, he had seen a lot of crimes of passion and failed attempts at covering up evidence, and this seemed like one of those cases where the perpetrator was trying to throw off the investigators. He was also shocked and horrified by Avis's multiple wounds inflicted by 2 different types of weapons. It appeared to be overkill, and she sustained what he considered defacing injuries. He decided that this murder was driven by rage or revenge. Someone had hurt Avis with a motive and wanted to make sure she was dead, possibly her unborn baby too. During the initial search, police were not able to find any fingerprints or DNA evidence in the house that wasn't Keon's or Avis's. They even brought in a police dog, but no luck. The dog was like, "Nope, can't smell any strangers here." Naturally, the police wondered if Keon was the one who had done this, the same guy who was sitting in their car waiting to be taken back to the station for questioning. He knew the exact time Avis got off work. He knew Avis better than anyone, and he, more than anyone, had a motive. I mean, if you look at the statistics for the majority of women who are murdered, most of the time it's their boyfriend, husband, or ex. Domestic altercations are a huge issue. Not to mention, Keon was the one who found Avis, but he hadn't even called 911. So what was going on with this guy? Keon was taken back to the station for questioning by Detective Dillard, and it was clear that Dillard was going to put him through the ringer. Keon was expressing all kinds of emotions, including grief, anger, and denial, and he just kept getting on his phone, calling people, texting nonstop. The detective noticed that Keon appeared remarkably calm and relaxed, which struck him as peculiar given the gravity of the situation he had just experienced. How could he look so unbothered? Keon had made a lot of phone calls while sitting in the police car in the waiting room, and before the interview started, Detective Dillard overheard Keon say to someone over the phone, "I don't like this at all. These mother effers think that I had something to do with this." So, Detective Dillard wondered what the issue was. Keon explained that he felt as though he was being targeted, that he was being looked at as a suspect from the get-go. But the detective explained that this was actually a routine interview. Everyone was going to go through an interview like this if they were close to Avis. Keon was the one who found Avis, and being very close to her, it was obvious that he would be questioned. If he truly cared about finding out what happened to his fiancée, he would cooperate with the investigators as best he could. Detective Dillard began by asking Keon some easier questions about his line of work and his outfit. Surprisingly, Keon actually laughed a few times and even tried to make a couple of jokes. This could have been a trauma response. Sometimes people laugh when they receive unexpected news. However, It could also be a sign that Keon was emotionally detached from what happened to Avis, didn't know how to handle it, or perhaps didn't trust the detectives. Maybe he thought they were going to imprison him on the spot without having any evidence that he did anything wrong. It's impossible to imagine all the thoughts running through Keon's head during this interview. But when Detective Dillard heard Keon laughing, he had to remind him that he was at the police station because his bride-to-be and unborn son had been murdered. Detective Dillard noticed that Keon was self-absorbed, frequently turning questions around to talk more about himself. He complained about how he was being treated, almost as if he were victimizing himself to distract from the topics at hand. At one point, Keon even claimed that Detective Dillard wouldn't let him use the bathroom, to which Dillard responded that he had already been allowed to use the bathroom. Keon countered that he hadn't interpreted it that way. While grieving, Keon might not have been in the most rational mindset, but that doesn't excuse being unhelpful, especially when the police were trying to figure out what happened to his fiancée. A few things particularly bothered Detective Dillard. The first was why Keon didn't call 911 from his cell phone right away. He not only went into the house, but also hadn't called when he came back outside. When questioned about this, Keon's excuse was that he didn't want to pay for roaming charges. For those who remember when cell phone plans only included certain areas, making calls outside those boundaries could incur extra charges. But this was an emergency. It was 911, and it was his fiancée. It seemed odd that he would stop and think about roaming charges at a time like that. He insisted that he didn't know where the 911 call would be routed, didn't think it would go through, and didn't want to waste time. Detective Dillard then asked Keon to recount what he did that day. Keon said he spent his day teaching at CH Middle School, as usual. After work, he ran some errands, including picking up groceries to bring home that evening after basketball practice, which began at 5:30 and lasted until about 7:30 or 7:45 p.m. He didn't want the groceries to spoil, so he asked a fellow coach who lived near the school if he could put them in their fridge and retrieve them quickly once practice was over. That's what he did. He dropped them off around 5 p.m., left around 5:10 p.m., and even called Avis on the way to the school gym. They talked once again just after practice started when Avis called to ask what was for dinner. He told her he'd be bringing food home. Keon finished up around 7:45 or so, left the school, picked up his groceries, and went home. While driving, he called Avis, but she didn't answer, which made him concerned. That's when he called her mother, Deborah, to ask if she'd heard from her, and she hadn't. We know what happened next. The detective had more questions, but Keon refused to talk as soon as he was read his Miranda rights. Keon stated that he was going to need to hire an attorney, especially if they were going to tell him he was innocent, but treat him like a suspect. He complained that in the United States it seems like you're guilty until proven innocent, ignoring the fact that his behavior was making him look guilty. Keon did hire an attorney, Antoine Patrick, who later shed more light on how Keon was treated during his interview. Allegedly, the police had told Keon multiple times to sit down and shut up, and Detective Dillard questioned him until 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. That's a long time, and while this might have been a slight exaggeration, it seemed like both parties in this interview clashed. Was Keon being difficult because the police were keeping him there so long, or were the police keeping him there so long because he was being difficult? Either way, Keon stopped talking and sought the advice of counsel, which is something everyone should do if they're ever being questioned in relation to any crime, especially a murder. Before letting him go, investigators photographed Keon's clothing. He was wearing a blue and white pinstripe dress shirt. It was a button-down polo, a gold chain, khaki pants, and a white undershirt. There was a blood stain on the top left under his shoulder area and more on his left sleeve. Another spot was on the bottom left, closer to his pants. There was also a bunch of blood streaked between the leg areas of his khakis, as well as on various other places on those pants, like the cuffs by the ankles. However, there didn't appear to be any blood on his shoes, which were lace-ups with brown leather and blue cloth. They did take swabs of Keon's hands, which had a noticeable amount of blood on them, even under his fingernails. And on his hands, they wanted to make sure there wasn't any gunpowder residue on them, so they did a GSR test. This test actually came back positive for gunpowder, but there was only a single particle on each hand. It's highly possible that residue rubbed off from Avis's clothing when Keon held her in his arms. That could also explain why her blood was on his clothing. Keon left the interview outraged at the way he was treated. Police had taken his cell phone, his clothing, and Avis's car in as evidence, and they got a search warrant for Keon's car, leaving him in a very vulnerable position. He didn't trust Detective Neal and Dillard at all. No matter how many times they reassured him that he was not a suspect, he didn't believe them. While Keon was hard for the police to stomach, there was not enough evidence to charge him with a crime. They did find a pair of shoes in the trunk of his car, but they didn't match the tread from the print left on the back door. However, they were a men's size 8, the exact same size as the prints left behind by the perpetrator. So, this definitely keeps him on their radar. It didn't matter whether they liked him or not. This wasn't enough evidence to hold him. Maybe he was just grieving in his own way, and that's why he needed to leave town. Because that's what he did. It was a detective's job to find out who killed them, be it Keon or someone else. Keon ended up leaving Jackson for a while to be with his family. After November 29th, he got a substitute teacher to cover his classes, and he quit his bartending job at the Mexican restaurant. This could be seen as running away to get the prying eyes off of him, but it didn't matter right now. Investigators had to put all the evidence together. They spent the next few days going door to door in the neighborhood and putting together a timeline for Avis's death. They believed, from her phone records and her GPS information, that Avis called and talked to Keon at 5:12 p.m. and again at 5:36 p.m. that evening when she was driving home from work. She arrived home between 5:50 and 6 p.m. They think she was killed shortly thereafter. They talked to Johnny Coleman, Avis's next-door neighbor. Now, he hadn't been around to call the police that night. He had actually driven his children home from school at 4:30 that day, and they had spent the whole evening indoors trying to ignore the construction workers. The workers stopped a little before 6 p.m., which would be around the time that Avis was ambushed coming home from work. When Johnny left for his night shift at 7:45, Avis's garage door was shut with the Christmas lights on outside her home. Everything looked normal. I wondered, were the Christmas lights usually turned on at this time? Did Avis turn them on when she got home? It doesn't seem like she would have had time. Or did the perpetrator turn them on? I'm genuinely wondering where the lights were plugged in, and I wasn't able to find any information on that. Maybe they were on a timer. I know that I've had ones like that before. But I just got this haunting image in my mind of Avis's murderer turning on the lights to make everything look normal, and that literally gives me chills. It's so creepy, especially since we know that they were inside of the house. The police ran into a bunch of dead ends with the neighbors since Avis's garage door was shut, so they started digging into Keon's life. First, they looked at his cell phone records. At 6 p.m., his cell phone pinged to a tower near Chastain Middle School. The rest of the evening, he moved around a lot, but none of the messages filtered through the Lake Harbor Drive cell tower, and that's the tower closest to his and Avis's house. Keon was still a suspect, but investigators needed to find a witness who could confirm that Keon was in the area that night, or even owned a gun. When detectives went to the Mexican restaurant where Keon worked, they started asking the other bartenders, the servers, and the regulars questions about him, and they cracked open a huge bombshell. According to Keon's co-workers, he was quite the ladies' man. Why did I see this part coming? They said that he had regulars coming in all the time to see him. Now, I mean, that's not too uncommon for bartenders, but they go one step further. Instead, they witnessed Keon flirting with women constantly. Still, not that out of the norm for a bartender, but it didn't end there. He had been seen kissing not just one woman, but several different women, who his co-workers referred to as his girlfriends. Yeah, so they would come in and visit him, and they would leave together at the end of his shifts. It was almost as though he had this side job to meet girls on the side. It was clear that Keon was living a double life. He was a player. If Avis had any idea, she never told any of her friends or family about it. But it's unlikely that she knew the whole story. When we love someone, it's really hard to imagine that they wouldn't be loyal until it's uncovered. Somehow, we want to trust them. And Avis didn't go visit Keon at the bar very often, so he could meet up with whoever he pleased at his workplace. Police were not surprised to hear about Keon's affairs because they overheard him calling someone babe over the phone in that initial interview room. That's right. When he was complaining about the detectives, he referred to the person on the other line as babe. So detectives made a note of it, and now they know why. But Keon cheating on Avis didn't mean that he was her murderer. Maybe he did love her, and maybe he just couldn't handle the commitment. But if he didn't love her, well, that would be a great motive. Avis was pregnant with his child. Did Keon just not want to be tied down? Was he the Chris Watts type of guy, a guy who thought he knew what he wanted but met someone else and changed his mind? So he took matters into his own hands and ended Avis's life so that he wouldn't have to have a kid around. It's a sickening thought, but it happens. This is not nearly enough evidence to charge Keon with anything, so police decided to follow a lead. One of Keon's restaurant co-workers had mentioned the name of one of the women he was seeing. Her name was Carla Hughes. She frequented the bar on the nights that Keon worked, and she also happened to be one of his co-workers at the school. The teachers would go out and hang out together, going to eat at nearby restaurants. But Carla would come in on her own to see Keon outside of work-related activities. Now, no one blatantly said they knew Keon and Carla were more than friends. They just mentioned her coming in regularly over the past few months. Detective Dillard went to Chastain Middle School on December 1st, 2 days after Avis was killed. He was there to interview Keon's colleagues, especially Carla Hughes. When he asked to speak with her, she immediately burst into tears. She was hysterically crying, and this looked suspicious. Detective Dillard asked her if she knew Avis, and that's why she was upset. Carla said she knew of her, but did not know her personally. She was crying because she and Keon worked together. They both coached together, and she was sad about what he was going through. Something so horrible. Dillard couldn't really conduct a proper interview because she was so emotional. So he scheduled a private interview with her later that evening after she was done with work. Then he went around the school asking questions about Keon and Carla. You already know who Keon is, but this is what they learned about Carla. The 25-year-old language arts teacher was from Greenville, Mississippi. She was born on June 12, 1981, and when she was only 6 weeks old, she was adopted by her uncle Carl and her aunt Linda Hughes. Her biological mother's cousin, Carla, went to T.L. Weston High School and regularly attended Mercy Seat Baptist Church. Her parents were school teachers and close friends with the pastor, the mayor, and other big names in town. Let me tell you, Carla was involved in everything: tennis, soccer, basketball, band, dancing, cheerleading, Key Club, the mayor's youth council, the Mississippi State Senate, and the list goes on. She excelled in horseback riding and beauty pageants. She finished 6th in the world in a horse showing competition at the age of 14. She won many awards and was an honor student. She was also voted most likely to succeed in life by her high school graduating class. Carla was a popular cheerleader growing up. She brought enthusiasm and spirit to the sidelines of every game. She was also a talented musician and played in the school band. Carla's involvement in different activities didn't stop there. She was happily engaged in her community, always seeking opportunities to make a positive impact. Her bubbly personality and her natural charisma made her everyone's favorite. She was well liked by her classmates and teachers alike. Carla earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Southern Mississippi in the early 2000s. Next, she earned her Master's of Education degree from B. Haven College in Jackson, Mississippi. And then she began taking graduate coursework in education at Delta State University while she was working at an elementary school. But then she decided to take the job as a 7th grade language arts teacher at Chastain Middle School in August, right before school started. Her parents were worried because everything happened so suddenly. She actually had to move nearby until she settled in. This wasn't the best part of town. She actually had a break-in less than 3 months after moving in. This was in early October. Someone actually tried to get into her back door, and she reported it to the Jackson Police Department. She was looking to relocate soon, but she loved her job, which came with a higher salary. She was the cheerleading coach, and she enjoyed making new friends with other teachers, including Keon. Everyone the detectives talked to said they loved Carla. She was really popular with the students as well as her co-workers. They said that she had a close relationship with fellow teachers, including Coach Keon Pittman. They had a habit of having long conversations outside of the office, calling each other and hanging out after class. When asked if they thought Keon and Carla were more than friends, no one could be 100% certain, but they wouldn't be surprised if they were. Later that evening, Carla and Detective Dillard had an 80-minute interview at the police station. During Carla's interview, she presented herself as personable, friendly, and helpful. The detectives asked her to recount what she did the day that Avis was murdered. She told them she saw Keon while they were both dismissing their students at the end of the day, and that's when he mentioned he was going grocery shopping. He asked her if he could put his food in her fridge while he went to basketball practice. She said yes, that would be fine, and that's what he did. Keon had gotten groceries after school from Rainbow Whole Foods and dropped the groceries off at 4:40 p.m. in Carla's fridge. Carla's apartment was between Rainbow Whole Foods and Chastain Middle School, so her place was a natural quick stop between errands and going to basketball practice. She said that Keon dropped off the groceries and left for practice. Carla went to the gym to work out. Keon then called her while he was at practice to figure out when he could come back and pick up the groceries. She promised that she was on her way home to take a shower, but he could pick them up at any time. Keon got off basketball practice at 7:30 p.m. Man stopped by her apartment for the groceries around 7:50. Carla said they chatted for a few minutes, and then she started to get ready for bed and called her mother. That is when he left to drive home. They asked her the next time she heard from him, although they already knew the answer from Keon's phone records. She told detectives Keon called her around 8:45 p.m. She was speaking with her mom and put her on hold to answer his call. She thought he was just going to say, "Hey, I made it home," and say goodnight. But instead he screamed, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" saying it over and over again. He told her that she needed to come to his house as fast as possible, that someone hurt Avis. Then Carla said that Keon described the scene to her, that it looked like their house had been robbed, that there was stuff everywhere, and Avis was lying unresponsive next to her car in a pool of blood under her head. There was blood scattered all around her body. Carla was overwhelmed. She was confused. She got back on the phone with her mom and told her everything. Carla asked her mom if she should go help Keon, and her mom said, "No, don't go over there. That's ridiculous. It's a crime scene." So Carla chose not to drive out and support Keon, even though Keon called her a couple more times over the course of that evening while he was sitting in the police car and while he was at the station. Detectives thought this was really suspicious, especially because they knew he didn't call 911. Instead, he was calling another woman. They asked Carla if Keon usually called her after he got off work, and she said yes, they do keep in touch. It makes sense. They're both coaches, and there are basketball and cheerleading schedules, as well as school events, so they may have to call and ask each other questions. But still, detectives wanted to understand the nature of these calls. Carla insisted they were innocent. As a matter of fact, Keon had even talked to Carla with Avis right there. For instance, when he and Carla and their colleagues were out after work, Keon would call Avis and name off everyone who was there, including Carla. She said that Avis knew she was one of Keon's friends and co-workers. Carla told police that she respected that Keon was engaged to be married and she didn't want more than a casual fling. She never told him to break up with Avis. She respected Avis as well, even though she didn't know her personally. Carla said she even stored her motorcycle at Keon's house for a while, and Avis didn't have a problem with her doing that. Wow, so this is a lot. Detective Dillard heard her story and found it plausible, since it matched up with everything Keon already told them. But the casual way that Carla was talking about everything really did seem weird. During the interview, she got a phone call from someone, and Detective Dillard noticed right away. She answered it calmly and jumped right back into the interview. At first, Carla had been breaking down, crying about Avis's death, and now she's talking about it completely collected. Detective Dillard wasn't sure what to think. Let's be real, Carla working out at the time of Avis's death wasn't the best alibi unless there were cameras at the gym or somebody had seen her. Everyone is a suspect. They can't simply toss out the idea that Keon and Carla being each other's alibis meant that maybe both of them had been involved. So he asked Carla if she owned a gun, and she said no, she did not. Then he asked her if she had access to a gun, and she said no, but that her dad had a lot of guns because he was a hunter. Finally, Dillard asked Carla what she thought about the fact that Avis and her child had died, and Carla's response was that it was very, very unfortunate. Detectives spent the next couple of days after Carla's interview trying to process all of the evidence and information they received. Then they began interviewing other people in the community. Any tips were welcome. They tried desperately to get in touch with Keon because they really wanted to interview him now that Carla explained what their relationship was really like. But he had mysteriously vanished off the face of the earth, which was pretty strange. With Carla and Keon acting so suspiciously, the detectives had to wonder if they really were in on this together. Was one of them the murderer and the other an accomplice? If so, which one? Or was it someone else entirely? That's what they needed to find out. Their biggest piece of evidence from the crime scene were the .38 caliber bullets that were recovered from Avis's body and the shoe prints. They had already searched through Keon's things at his house and were unable to locate any shoes that had the same tread as the ones that were left on that back door. But remember that they were the right size. So, could he have gotten rid of them somehow? Before they could even begin to look into that, the police got a tip. But since I haven't even told you about the autopsy, I'm going to quickly explain what was ascertained from that exam, and then proceed to let you know about the first big break in this case. As I stated, 4.38 caliber bullets were recovered from Avis's body. 3 of the 4 gunshot wounds were fatal. 1 bullet hit her thigh, another hit her stomach and exited through her glutes, another hit the left side of her chest, and the last one was to the back of her head, execution style. All of the bullets had been fired from very close proximity, suggesting that Avis was ambushed as soon as she got out of her car. A knife or another sharp-bladed object had been used to stab her several times in the head, as well as slash her throat. But these wounds seemed to have been inflicted post-mortem, after she was already dead, which is so brutal and cruel. It was confirmed that there were no signs of forced sexual activity, so it did seem like that part was staged. They deduced that the murder weapon was a 5-shot revolver, and sadly, it was confirmed that Avis was in her 2nd trimester of her pregnancy. Since her unborn child died as a result of Avis being killed, his death was ruled a homicide, like hers. The theory was that the killer was waiting inside the house for Avis to pull up. They could hear the garage door open, and could hear her pulling her car in, and then closing the garage door behind her. As soon as she got out of her vehicle, the killer ambushed her, most likely shooting her in the leg first to stop her in her tracks, and then they proceeded to fire the other 4 shots. 1 missed and went through the garage door. The 3 others made contact and killed Avis. The rest was overkill and very personal. All of it seemed impersonal. Avis was lying on that cold concrete ground, dying all alone for 3 hours until Keon alerted the police that she was dead. It's so heartbreaking to think about what she must have thought in those final moments. Some say that head wounds like hers would have killed a person right away, but we will never know. We can only hope that she did not suffer too long. I told you that a tip came in while an attorney in the Jackson area called in on December 5th to say that he had information about a gun. He actually had it in his possession, and it matched the description of the one that could have been used in Avis's case. He also had a witness who could tie the gun back to the person who they believed committed the crime. Investigators contacted this witness and brought him in for an interview. His name is Patrick Nash. He's Carla Hughes's first cousin. You're hearing her name again. Their mothers are sisters. He and his dad, Carla's uncle James, lived in Jackson. He said that on November 26th, 3 days before the shooting, Carla came to Patrick's house and asked him to borrow some weapons to protect herself. She lived in a really rough neighborhood, and her apartment had already been broken into several times since August. Her dad actually had to drive up from Greenville and fix the lock on her door at one point. So Carla told Patrick that she did not feel safe and that it would make her feel better if she was able to defend herself if something like that happened again. At first, Patrick suggested that she get a can of mace, but Carla said that would not be enough and asked him if he had any extra guns that she could hold on to until she moved out of there. For starters, Patrick gave her a 4-inch folding hunting knife and then went to look for a gun that he could loan his cousin. He gave Carla a Rossi .38 caliber revolver that held 5 bullets. He showed her how to use the gun, loaded it with 5 bullets, and sent her on her way. He didn't think much of it at the time, but on the evening of December 1st, right after Carla got out of the interview with Detective Dillard, she went back to Patrick's house and returned the revolver. It was freshly cleaned and the bullets were no longer inside. When Patrick asked Carla where they were, she said she had used them for target practice. Remember that exactly 5 bullets were fired at the crime scene, and he never saw that knife again. Patrick already knew Avis had died because Carla told him on the night of Avis's murder. She called him and let him know, so all the details lined up. Patrick and James honestly didn't know what to do. They both loved Carla and found her to be a really compassionate and peaceful person. They just didn't think she was capable of this violence, capable of murder. Did she even know that the bullets had been used? Had she cleaned the gun, or had someone else used it and not told her? They didn't know, but what they did know was that they needed to come forward together. Patrick and James went to a lawyer with the gun, and the lawyer went to the police. The police were so grateful that they'd come forward. Patrick and James were stand-up citizens. They did the right thing by giving the police this information. This is a sign for anyone out there who has ever seen anything sketchy. Tips really matter. They can change the course of an entire investigation. If you see something, say something, please, even if it's family. Because remember, someone else's loved one has been taken away, and you'd want someone to do the same for you. Investigators sent the revolver to a ballistics company, and they conducted some test fires. They determined that yes, the bullets used in the revolver were a positive match for the bullets used to kill Avis. Since Carla was in possession of that gun on November 29th, it was confirmed that she was somehow involved in this crime and was actively working to cover it up. She lied to detectives not once but twice. First, she told them that she was just friends with Keon, and then she said that she didn't have access to a weapon. That's not a good look when you're a suspect. On the morning of December 6th, Avis and her unborn son Ken's funeral was held at Locust Grove Church. It was a day filled with grief and sorrow. The funeral occurred on the same day that Avis was supposed to receive her master's degree. It was a bitter irony that she couldn't be there to celebrate her academic achievement. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to pay their respects and to say goodbye to a woman who touched so many lives. As everyone was gathering around, reminiscing about Avis's life and her impact, Keon walked in. You could feel the tension. Avis's family had just recently found out about his affair with Carla Hughes, and emotions were running high. But the police were on site in case anything were to happen. Fred and Deborah were outraged that Keon would even show his face at that funeral. Fred thought for sure that he was responsible for Avis's death. They remembered back to Thanksgiving weekend when Keon was spending all that time pacing around and talking on the phone. They wondered if this had anything to do with Avis's death. LaTanya disagreed with her dad. There was something about her sister's death that seemed so brutal and calculated that she thought there was something more to it. Either way, they felt that Keon had some role in Avis's murder, and the family was furious that he had the audacity to show up and not even cry. They saw him pretending to be upset, but Fred and Deborah described what he was doing as just hollering. There weren't any tears coming out of his eyes, it was just noise. The devil's advocate would say that everyone grieves in their own way, but the Banks family was not having it. LaTonya told Keon she would beat his ass. Her husband had to literally hold her back from attacking him. That's when a scuffle began, and a few men started to turn on Keon. The police had to intervene and escort him to his car, with some sort of cloth or coat shielding his face from view. He never saw the Banks family again after that. That would be tough. On one hand, he's your loved one's fiancé and their unborn child, but on the other hand, he's a suspect, so I don't know what I would do. But I think I would lean more towards not wanting him there. Even if he merely cheated on my family member while they were pregnant with his child. That would be enough for me, probably not to want to see him again because of his disrespect. Avis definitely didn't deserve that level of disrespect and drama at her funeral. And I wish I didn't have to be sitting here right now telling you the story of her murder, as well as all of the deeper secrets I'm about to uncover. After speaking with Patrick Nash, Carla Hughes was called in for another interview, and this time she brought a lawyer. The man she brought in was Johnny Walls, a well-known state senator who knew the Hughes family very well from back in Greenville. He had known Carla Hughes since she was just a little girl. Johnny met Carla when she was in high school and held her in very high regard. Remember that Carla was very accomplished. I told you about all of her honors when she was growing up. So he was shocked that she would be involved in a crime of this magnitude. There weren't many questions she was willing to answer, but at one point, when the detective stepped out of the room, she and her lawyer friend kept talking. They should have known better, since most of us know that all police stations are recording audio and sometimes video in their interview rooms. There they sat, whispering to one another, and her lawyer said something to the effect of, "They're waiting for you to give them information about Keon and his involvement in all this. If you point the finger at him, it'll take the pressure off of you." But she just responded that she couldn't do that because she didn't know what happened. Well, the Ren PD charged Carla with accessory to murder after the fact, hoping that she would come clean and tell them what she knew about the man it seemed like she was covering for. But she remained silent. Considering Carla had always been so well-liked and successful in her life, her arrest came as a huge shock to her community. Everyone thought she was well-grounded and genuinely nice. She was never even agitated or raised her voice. She was stubborn sometimes, but many of us can be. She was always the type to take the high road. Carla lived by the philosophy her mother taught her, which was, God says to turn the other cheek. So all this was hard for people to wrap their minds around. Carla being charged with accessory to murder. It's possible. In all the videos I've done, I've realized anyone is capable of spiraling down into the depths of depravity. It's what I talk about in my Dark Livity podcast. Even those we least expect, model students, best friends, people without any mental health concerns or criminal histories, can become involved in violence. Keon didn't have a criminal history either, but at least one of them had stooped to this level of excessive, monstrous violence, and investigators needed to figure out who. Once the police served Carla the papers charging her with accessory to murder, the detectives once again left the room, and she and her lawyer discussed the situation among themselves. Her lawyer told Carla that she shouldn't be too concerned. The police were certain Keon was the culprit. They just needed an accusation, and Carla would be the best person to blame Keon. He told her that the reason she was being charged was because Patrick had reported under oath that Carla returned the gun to him empty, and that she had been crying when she gave it back to him. Carla said she wasn't crying, and that she didn't know who killed Avis because she wasn't there to witness it. She stood firm. She would not accuse Keon of any crime. Johnny wanted to know why Carla was trying to protect Keon. To the police and everyone else trying to understand this crime, it didn't make sense. Why wouldn't she save herself? There was only speculation. They thought Carla might be in love with Keon, and that's why she refused to point the finger. If Carla truly didn't know what happened and it was someone else who had killed Avis, was she just being honest and trying to stay true to herself? She certainly wasn't going to plead guilty, not when police had so little evidence against her. Together, Carla and Johnny agreed that she would plead not guilty and remain silent. Because she did remain silent, it reinforced her charge. She was taken to the Madison County Detention Center and resigned from her job at Chastain Middle School. In the following days, news outlets reporting on the crime kept asking Lieutenant Neal why Carla was charged, but he didn't reveal any information to the press. Instead, he continued to reach out to Keon, whose car was now missing. He had never gone back to school or told anyone if he might come back. The kids at the school were so confused about what happened to their favorite language arts and science teacher. It felt like a big hole in their community. The flood of newspaper articles kept saying the same thing. The police couldn't comment on Avis's case until Keon was interviewed. Deborah and Fred were relieved that someone was being charged in the crime. Deborah told the Clarion Ledger on December 7th that she had actually met Carla before. It's true she'd been to one of Avis's housewarming parties. Carla had visited as Keon's friend. There were reports that Avis and Carla knew one another, and since Avis and Keon had been living in their house long before Carla started teaching at Chastain, the timeline was a little bit off. But this showed me just how much Avis's case was affecting her family. Deborah was horrified and upset to learn that she might have met the person who killed her daughter, especially knowing that this crime could have been prevented if Carla would have just run off with Keon and left Avis alone. Anything would have been better than this. On Friday, December 8th, Lieutenant Neal continued his investigation, now directing his efforts to figure out if Carla committed this crime. He applied for a search warrant on the 6th, and you know those things take a few days to go through, but finally it was ready. Detective Dillard actually recorded a walkthrough video of Carla's apartment, hoping to find a few different things: the missing bullet shells, a missing folding knife, blood-stained clothing, shoes that matched the shoe print on the door, gloves, or any written communication between Carla and Keon that would reveal more about their relationship. The search found 3 things. First, they found a photograph of Keon propped up on Carla's nightstand among a bunch of other photos that she had of him. This further established the affair between the two of them. Second, a handwritten poem addressed to Carla and signed with the initials KP, which we know as Keon Pittman's initials. Third, as Carla's closet was being searched, they found hundreds of shoes still in their boxes. You can see them right here, but one pair stood out: a size 10 women's black tread-safe tennis shoe. These were non-slip shoes that someone would usually wear to work if they were like waiting tables. Police sent the shoes to the Mississippi Crime Laboratory, and the tread pattern, you could even look at it, was identical to the shoe print found on Avis's back door. And here's what's so interesting. A size 10 in women's is a size 8 in men's. So these shoes were the exact same size they were looking for all along. They were quickly sent to the lab for DNA testing. The initial test detected no DNA on the shoes. However, the detectives decided to send them to a second lab for a more in-depth analysis. There, a technician carefully examined them under a microscope and was astonished to find several microscopic bloodstains on that shoe. The technician conducted DNA testing on those dried bloodstains, and the results were conclusive. The blood found on the shoe was an exact match for Avis Banks. This evidence indicated that Carla came into contact with Avis at some time during her murder, and the charges against Carla were upgraded to 2 counts of capital murder. In Mississippi, killing a pregnant woman is the equivalent of killing 2 people, and the consequences of capital murder are either life in prison or the death penalty. Carla's prison time started immediately after she was charged. She was held without bond at the detention center, and police finally revealed to the newspapers that she was charged because she was associated with both the murder weapon and the shoe print. That's pretty damning. Fred and Deborah did not attend Carla's initial hearing, but they said they were glad someone was being brought to justice. The matter of Keon's innocence was yet to be determined. Police still needed to track this man down. As far as we know, Keon was never officially fired from Chastain, but since he never promised to return, it counted as a resignation. On December 13th, he did drive to the police department to talk to Lieutenant Neal, but Keon turned his car around as soon as he saw reporters. Antoine, his lawyer, said that Keon would return to work in January once the media stopped intensely covering this case. He made an offer to the police that Keon would answer all their questions in written form, like an email, but that wasn't going to cut it. There was so much nonverbal body language that could be analyzed through an in-person interview. It was crucial that police figure out how Keon was involved, and they needed to interview him in person. They finally got their chance in January. He was a witness at Carla's preliminary trial, which was held on January 2nd, 2007. The courtroom was packed, and Keon answered several questions about his affair with Carla. Interestingly enough, it didn't quite match up with Carla's interpretation of their relationship. This is gonna get good, so please don't leave now. Here's where it gets very interesting and equally disturbing, and I hope you're ready for this. Keon was introduced to Carla when she began working at the middle school in August of 2006, and he said there was instant chemistry between the two of them. It began with innocent flirting, but it quickly turned into them passing notes to one another during school hours, with their students actually facilitating this. Keon would write one note and then have a student drop it off to Carla, and vice versa. Very inappropriate. Carla was so similar to Avis. They were both intelligent, accomplished, beautiful women, but Carla was her opposite in some ways that Keon was very attracted to. She was social and enjoyed partying, whereas Avis liked to stay at home and was more family-oriented. Carla was his fun girl, and she quickly began making it obvious that she was interested in Keon, regardless of the fact that he had a fiancée at home who was pregnant with his baby. That's just pathetic. After only 3 weeks of knowing each other, she tells Keon that she rides a motorcycle, which of course intrigued him. So she offered to go on a ride with him. They just needed to stop by her apartment close to school so she could change real fast. But instead of seeking the privacy of her bathroom or bedroom alone, no, Carla just takes her clothes off right in front of Keon. He got the message loud and clear, and soon Carla was coming over to Keon's bar and drinking all night, which eventually led them to go back to her place and have sex. This was only a few days after she got naked right in front of him. That was the other thing. Keon said that Carla wouldn't say no to anything when it came to the bedroom. They began sleeping together 3 or 4 times a week, and Keon described it as a sexual adventure. They weren't hiding their affair. When Carla came into his bar, Keon would pay her special attention and even played with her feet at her table in front of other customers and co-workers. They were very brazen. All of this happening while Avis was pregnant. She was working all day, waiting for him to get back home from what she thought was him working hard to provide for their growing family. It disgusts me, and I hope this case is a big eye-opener. But many men don't watch these videos, so it's most likely only going to cause women to have more fear and anxiety, because I know that's what it did to me, sadly. But this isn't me just pointing fingers at men. Ladies, take note of how dangerous an affair can be. On Labor Day weekend in September, just a few weeks after they started sleeping together, Keon boldly took a trip to Memphis with Carla. I don't know how he pulled that off, but while there, he confided in her that he was not always completely satisfied with his relationship with Avis. To what extent, I don't know, but he said he realized after all this that he may have led Carla on when he was just in his feelings. At the time, he didn't love Carla, it was merely sexual, according to him. But I think writing someone a poem is more emotional than just physical. Would you agree or not? Well, Carla became more and more possessive over Keon as time went on. She began to imagine what it would be like if she were his wife, living in a nice house, having his baby, not Avis. Carla didn't hold back. She began pressuring Keon to break things off with Avis, but he refused. Even when Carla told him that she was in love with him, now we're only hearing his side of things. We don't know what he actually told Carla, but she must have thought the pregnancy was a big reason that Keon wouldn't leave. That may be why Carla announced to Keon that she was pregnant with his baby. Shocked when he heard this, Keon had no idea how he was going to deal with two pregnant women in his life at the same time. Carla was getting bolder as well. She wanted Keon to get caught. There was one weekend when he and Avis took a trip to attend his cousin's wedding in Detroit, and when they got back to the airport in Mississippi, Carla was there waiting in her car, watching them. Keon pretended that he did not see her, and thankfully Avis was not aware of her presence. But the next time he was with Carla, he confronted her about this, and Carla lied, saying her aunt was borrowing her car. But finally, she came clean and told him she just wanted to see who he was bringing on his trip to Detroit. Carla was well aware that she wasn't the only person Keon was cheating with. Later in October, she said that her pregnancy test was not valid, it was a false positive. Her doctor said it had something to do with her birth control method that she was using, whatever that means. But I think it's clear that Carla wasn't being honest to begin with. Keon was so happy to receive this news that she was not having his baby, and Carla became irate. How dare he be happy that she wasn't pregnant? So she threatened to drive over to Avis and tell her about their affair. She actually got in her car, started driving over there, and he was following behind her, calling her on the phone and begging her not to. He finally said if she pulled up to his house, he would call the police. Carla finally backed down. Despite all this, Keon still thought the sex was worth all of this drama, because he continued seeing Carla. He said it was like he was addicted, but insisted he wasn't making love to her. Well, maybe not in his mind, but it was clear that Carla wanted more. By the time Thanksgiving came around, Keon and Avis made their way to Land's out in Houston. Remember, his phone kept ringing? Well, it was another woman, Carla, begging him to come spend the holidays with her. Oh, and by the way, Keon had met Carla's friends and family, and when he did, she would introduce him as her future husband. Yeah, he didn't see that as a red flag. Carla kept interrupting dinner, and Keon kept answering instead of ignoring her calls. Finally, Avis jokingly asked him, "Who's that your girlfriend that keeps calling?" He made light of it, saying it was a family issue. You'd think all of this was quite a hassle for Keon, so much so that he would just stop seeing Carla. Plus, if it was just sex, then why was he doing so much for her and risking so much? The weekend after Thanksgiving, Avis and Keon made a trip out to his mom's house to spend some time there. Well, guess who drives out there with a friend and gets a hotel nearby? Yeah, Carla. She was begging Keon to come see her. He finally gave in to her demands and met her at a bar on Saturday night. I don't know how he was able to excuse his absence to Avis and his mother, but after a few drinks, Keon told Carla he had to get back to his mom. This was supposed to be family time, and she was livid. She didn't like being second, so an argument started and continued into the next day over texts and calls. At this point, Carla told Keon that something had to change. She insisted that Avis wasn't the right person for him and that they should just run away together. He agreed on one thing. Something did need to change. So he decided to go distant and stop returning her messages and calls because he'd had enough. Then, Keon described the events of the evening that Avis was murdered. We already know all of that. Remember, he's on the stand saying all this at Carla's preliminary hearing. But when Carla's defense attorney, Johnny Walls, began questioning Keon, he wasn't as forthcoming with his information. He refused to answer any questions. How frustrating is that? He took the stand, swore to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, but remained silent. But I guess he has the right to protect himself. Because of Keon's behavior, everyone in the room started to suspect he was hiding something. Johnny was understandably frustrated and ended his questioning by asking Keon, "Have you had a chance to cry yet?" Everyone in the courtroom gasped, and a couple of people laughed. I mean, Keon was not the easiest guy to like based on his string of affairs, but nobody expected Johnny to burn him like that in front of the whole courtroom. The judge ruled that he would appoint a grand jury for Carla's trial. There was a ton of evidence to uncover, some of which was still being processed, and the community was increasingly invested in the outcome of this case. There was a lot of outward support for Carla, and Deborah said it was really hard to stomach. There was all this rhetoric going around about how great Carla was when her daughter was the victim. All she was doing was hearing about how great of a person Carla was, how many beauty pageants she won, and how everyone thought this had to be a mistake. In February 2007, the state decided to pursue the death penalty against Karla due to the particularly cruel and heinous nature of Avis's murder. When a reporter for the Clarion Ledger interviewed Deborah Banks, Avis's mom, she was asked for her thoughts, and Deborah responded with, "Well, she brought this on herself." There were 3 whole years between Karla's preliminary hearing and the actual trial. It usually takes a year or 2, but this was a long time, and a lot happened in preparation for this trial. In 2007, Johnny filed 11 motions to relieve Karla of her potential sentence. He motioned to replace a few jury members, then demanded that the jury never hear the words "death penalty." He wanted the verdict and sentencing to be done in 2 separate rulings. He also argued that Karla should be completely relieved of her charges because she was discriminated against due to her race. This was not unheard of. Discrimination does happen, but the way Johnny went about this was in bad taste. The victim in this case was also a black female, so his argument that Karla should be released because she was already a victim as a descendant of slaves and had to endure that lifelong sentence, so to speak, that last motion didn't go through. But Johnny was definitely putting in the work and living up to his title as defense attorney, though he was also grasping at straws. In 2007, Keon also stopped talking to his lawyer, and the police just gave up trying to get in touch with him. By December of that year, Keon had straight up left Mississippi for Detroit, and he got married to another woman there. I'll say what you're probably thinking. That was fast. But grief is cyclical, and maybe a new wife was just the support system he needed. Side note, I did notice that he changed his name. He and his new wife, who is also a teacher and has a degree in elementary education but is also a master herbalist, opened up a botanical institute. It's an online school where they teach the proper implementation of botanical knowledge and herbal wisdom, according to their company's website, which is still in operation today. What a total life change. When the police find out that Keon is married, they got a copy of his marriage certificate and gave it to Karla for Valentine's Day in 2008. That's juvenile on so many levels, but it was worth a shot to see if she would talk. Karla did not take the bait. She said she wasn't surprised he was married and continued to remain silent on whether Keon was an accessory. A couple of reasons this trial took so long was that the region changed district attorneys, and then Lieutenant Neal needed surgery after he fell off a 15-foot ladder. But on Monday, October 5th, 2009, the long wait was over. Finally, the Banks family could get the answers they deserved. The Madison County courtroom in Jackson was filled with people, and Karla pled not guilty to 2 counts of capital murder and burglary with the intent to assault. Prosecutors Michael Guest and John Finger said that Karla wanted to be married to Keon, so she killed Avis out of jealousy. The defense attorney Johnny Walls said Keon had framed Karla, and he was the only person responsible for Avis and his unborn child's passing away. Keon was the key witness. On Tuesday, he spoke for 4 hours, and I'm going to try to summarize everything for you, but trust me, there are a lot of gaps that he filled in. I'm going to make it quick. First, he said he was innocent. He called himself a fool for sleeping with Karla. He explained that he and Karla texted all the time, and though Avis never officially met her, they had seen each other at the airport and in passing. Avis knew they were friends, but not that they were hooking up. She trusted Keon and never would have thought he was cheating. Keon felt guilty that Avis went to work, came home, and devoted her life to their family, and that he put her at risk by running around with this other woman. He felt partially responsible for what happened. At least he could own up to his behaviors and recognize where he messed up. Then he described his affair with Karla. We've already heard most of it, but wow, just wow. Karla and Keon had the audacity to have sex in Avis's house 3 different times when she was at work. So Karla had been in that house enough times to know the full layout, and that was important. They spent so much time together for a while that Keon had a key to Karla's apartment, though he said he gave it back in mid-November. This would come in handy when it came to Karla's defense. Keon said he was totally stringing Karla along. There was no emotional connection. But he did everything to make her feel special, and she wanted to spend time with him constantly. She kept his love notes in her bedroom and was in complete denial about him not wanting more. Keon told some wild stories, but keep in mind this is Keon trying to save himself from being implicated and sent to jail. He told the court that Carla was basically stalking him, even though he was the one who agreed to meet her all of those times, which was wild to me. On Sunday, November 26th, Keon said he was talking to Carla on the phone while he was spending time with Fred and Deborah. It was during that disagreement that Carla said, "From this point on, some things are going to change." That was so ominous, and it was also the night that Carla retrieved that gun from Patrick. Keon said that after his and Carla's disagreement, they didn't talk much for the rest of that week. He also said the last time he hooked up with her was mid-November. But what were they doing in Carla's hotel room the weekend before Avis's death? And why did they spend so much time together on that Wednesday night before he drove back home and found her dead? He was at her apartment, getting groceries, I'm doing air quotes, for almost an hour, so something does not add up. But Keon broke down the timeline of events. He confirmed Carla's statement that he dropped off the groceries at her house, left around 5:15, went to basketball practice, and spent the entire time texting another woman, Bridget. Bridget was a mom of one of the kids he was coaching. She was at the gym the entire time that he was there, texting him from right across the room. Of course, Bridget didn't want anyone to know about their flirtationship, as I'm calling it, with Keon, the coach. She was married, and the flirty text messages kept up the excitement of the affair. But later, Bridget testified that Keon was at practice the whole time, and she was also one of the women he was having sex with, even a few months after Avis died. To me, it feels a bit heartless, but it also means that Keon had an alibi between 5:50 and 6 p.m. when the police believed that Avis was killed. Other parents came forward and testified to these facts as well. He was at practice when it started. When Keon picked up his groceries from Carla's place, he said she was quiet, which was not normal. She was usually very energetic and talkative. He did admit that he stayed for about 40 minutes, and then he called Avis on his way home. But when she didn't respond, he freaked out, and once again, something doesn't add up. Keon was saying that he had a feeling something was wrong, and that he knew this before he even opened the garage. It didn't really add up to me. He said that he actually left his car door open. You can see it right here, the car is still running, but the garage door was shut at that time when he pulled in. So how did he know something wasn't right before actually opening it? Maybe I'm a little confused with his statements, but what we did know was that when Keon found Avis, he panicked. He said that's why he called Carla and another woman, who I'm assuming was Bridget, hoping that they would come over and support him through this trying time. He was in shock, and he said he wasn't having rational reactions under the circumstances. When Keon was asked why he didn't immediately call 911, he again told the jury that he just didn't think the call would go through. He had purchased his phone outside the region, so he thought the phone would connect to the wrong police department. I don't know if this is just an excuse or if he really didn't know how 911 worked or how phones worked. What do you think? The defense asked Keon about the tread-safe tennis shoes that Carla owned, and it turns out Carla had actually gifted these shoes to Keon. They were non-slip shoes that were really good for bartending. However, when he wore them into the Mexican restaurant, Keon said that they told him he wasn't allowed to wear those specific shoes, so he gave them back to her in mid-November. Why does everything happen in mid-November? It's like he gave the key back to her in mid-November, the shoes back to her in mid-November. It's weird. The defense was convinced that Keon had used the key that Carla gave him to let himself into her apartment, borrow those shoes, wear them to the scene of the crime, and then put them back. Because why would Carla, if she did this, put bloody shoes back in her own closet? But, according to the police, Keon was not wearing those tread-safe shoes that evening. He would not have had any time to do all that when he was taken from the scene right to the police station. He was wearing lace-up Cole Haans. Keon spent his entire testimony crying but without tears. Just like at Avis's funeral, Deborah told DeLine that she thought he just rubbed his eyes until they were red just before he took the stand, so it looked like he was more upset. And let's be real, everyone could see through Keon's BS at this point. But was he really a murderer or involved? It was up to the jury to decide. Later that week, during the trial, the prosecution and the defense brought in cell phone experts. Keon and Carla's cell phone devices had been all over the place that evening, and it seemed like the only way to find out who killed Avis was to figure out where they were between 5:50 and 6 p.m. A cell phone engineer testified for the defense that someone could start a call in one area, drive to the next, and commit a murder while the phone call was still going on. During that time, it would only register to the original cell tower where the call was started. This could create an alibi, and the perpetrator could get away with a crime, but you would need to be on the phone the entire time. From what it looks like, most of the calls Keon and Carla made that evening were very short check-ins. They weren't on the phone for a long period. Another guy, an AT&T engineer, confirmed that Avis's last call to Keon pinged at the Lake Harbor Drive cell phone tower, a tower with a 2.5-mile radius that included the Blackthorn subdivision where Avis and Keon lived. So at 5:36, when Avis called Keon about their dinner plans, she was even closer to home. The AT&T engineer also said that Keon's calls came from Carla's place, then Chastain, then the grocery store, but he was never anywhere near his own home. That is until 8:41 and 8:56, when he made 2 calls that pinged off the Lake Harbor Drive tower, which did show that he got home around 8:30. Keon called Carla at 5:37, right after he called Avis about dinner. Who knows what they talked about? Was it about him picking up his groceries, or was it something else? When Keon made that call to her and she ended that call, her phone showed that she was somewhere within 2 miles of Avis's home. Then, at 6:04, Carla made another outgoing call, and once again her phone pinged at the Lake Harbor Drive tower. At 6:07, she called someone else, and now she was out of range and on her way back home. One of these post-6 p.m. calls was made to Keon while he was at practice. So what did they need to talk about? Did Carla tell him what she had done, or was she confirming it was finished? Both sides have their theories. Carla did have one friend that lived near the Lake Harbor Drive cell tower, but when questioned, that friend said that Carla had not come to visit on the 29th. Why was she near that particular tower then? Her gym was close to her home. It was now clear that Carla was the one who killed Avis in cold blood, and Keon might have been an accessory based on the numerous calls over the course of that day. But there was no way to figure out what they said to each other over the phone. Carla remained silent. But one huge bombshell that was revealed, which I could not believe, was that Carla had a son. He was 2 years old at the time she moved to Jackson to take the job at Chain Middle School. But she left him behind to be cared for by her parents so she could concentrate on her new job. But that also meant she was free to do whatever she pleased with Keon. But here's the shocking part. Back in 2004, Carla was supposed to get married to her fiancé, and she, too, just like Avis, was pregnant when they were supposed to exchange their vows. But just days before her wedding, her fiancé called it all off, leaving her to raise her son all alone as a single mother. All of her dreams were shattered. It was a very odd coincidence. If she had killed Avis, was this some type of subconscious revenge for her own life not turning out as she planned? Did she want to stop this other woman from getting what she couldn't have? I couldn't believe it when I heard it, but the defense tried to prove that Keon was the killer. Johnny brought up the key that Keon had borrowed from Carla, the gunpowder residue on his hands, and his intimate knowledge of what Carla's apartment looked like. But Keon didn't know where Carla kept her cousin's gun. He didn't have the key anymore. Even Carla's extended family was convinced that she was the one who actually killed Avis. As much as they didn't want to believe it was true, Carla's Uncle James said that when she returned the gun to him and Patrick, he asked her if she had used the gun to kill anyone. She dropped her head and shrugged her shoulders. James wasn't sure what that meant. Carla either didn't know what happened, or she had killed Avis and just didn't want to admit it. Starting Monday, October 12th, the jury began their deliberations. They asked if Carla could testify, but she remained silent. After 8 hours of deliberation, Carla was found guilty. When the verdict was read, Deborah became very upset. She even fainted and needed to recover in a separate room. Linda, who is Carla's mother, went to her and prayed with her, and Fred and Carla prayed for one another. Both families were lost in this tragic crime. Both families were grieving. After 3 long years of seeking justice for Avis's murder, the Banks and the Hughes families were absolutely exhausted. After spending all this time together, they connected through such a horrible event. The two families had formed an acquaintanceship. They bonded by loss. They wanted the best for one another, and they wanted all of this to be over. Carla's sentencing was set for Wednesday, the 14th, and Carl pleaded for her life. Her son was now 5 years old, and if Carla was given the death penalty, her child would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. The jury agreed and gave Carla 2 sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead of death. Wow, that's a lot, and this case just seems to keep going, but I'm almost done. Johnny will forever be known as a defense lawyer who just doesn't quit. Carla appealed the verdict on 6 different counts for showing DNA evidence, for asking if she wanted to testify, etc. I'm not going to go into all of it because the reality is that all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to Carla. She borrowed the gun, she was at the scene of the crime, her shoes had blood on them. It was Carla, and the appeal was dismissed. She was transferred to the Central Mississippi Women's Correctional Facility, where she's going to spend the rest of her life. I guess we'll never know if Keon had any role in Avis's murder. Sometimes cases are frustrating like that. I still have so many questions about this case, like what were Keon and Carla saying to each other on the phone the 5+ times they called each other that night? Could it have just been a way for Carla to make it look like nothing nefarious was going on? I'm definitely not Keon's biggest fan. I'm appalled by his behavior when it came to all the times he cheated on Avis that we know of. But if he was an accessory in Avis's murder, he's the one who's going to pay for it in guilt and shame for the rest of his life. And if Keon truly had no idea what happened to his fiancée and his unborn child, then my heart goes out to him. Losing someone you love when you have all these plans and your whole life ahead of you is extremely devastating and hard to bounce back from. From what I know and have learned about Avis, she was an absolutely wonderful woman, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to continue her legacy by talking about her today. Her passion for affordable daycare, her persistent kindness and generosity, and her commitment to her family. Fred said he pities Keon Pittman, saying that once he had a perfect life with Avis and he threw it all away, which resulted in Avis's death. Avis's family is haunted by a constant wonder about what life would have been like for her and her unborn son if they hadn't been brutally murdered. She had so much potential to make a difference in this world. I'll leave you with Deborah and Fred's words after the sentencing. Deborah said that no matter what came out of this case, she knows that Avis will haunt Keon and Carla every night before they go to sleep. Fred said that now Avis's murderers are behind bars and she can finally rest in peace.